All right, ladies and gentlemen. This is again the House Judiciary Committee again on November the 8th now at 2:30. We're going to start our briefing again. This is a second briefing that we will have had on juvenile justice issues. We're going to hear from three different people and groups today, starting with Clyde Boatwright, the Fraternal Order of Police's president for the state of Maryland. He's going to be joining us virtually, and I do appreciate his willingness. He is at an event out of the state. He's making the time to be here today virtually, and so appreciate that. Nick Maroney will come after him. There'll be a briefing of the Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit, which is based within the Office of the Attorney General. And then we're going to get a briefing from members of the Juvenile Justice Reform Council. We'll hear from Melissa Sigmund, Eric Ford, and Nate Bayless. So we're going to start with Mr. Boatwright. We're going to give them each 12 minutes to make their initial comments. I have no doubt that there will be questions from the committee. So if they don't quite finish, they'll be able to take questions after. May have told Mr. Boatwright 10 minutes, so now he gets an extra 2 minutes, and let's see what he does. All right, with that, Mr. Boatwright, are you with us?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Can you hear me?
Go right ahead.
All right, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Clyde Boatwright, and I am a 23-year Maryland law enforcement veteran and the president of the Maryland State Fraternal Order of Police. Our organization was founded 56 years ago today in Hagerstown, Maryland, and we currently represent over 21,000 police officers across the state of Maryland. In the few minutes that I have with you, I want to use the time to talk about solutions to a problem that is impacting Marylanders across this great state. Juvenile crime is exploding in our community, and we need an all-hands-on-deck approach to stop this crime crisis. Juvenile crime is not unique to one community, nor is it something new. What is new is our approach to addressing the crime crisis and the results we are seeing play the results that we are seeing play out every day. Accountability and structure are missing. Root causes are important as to why a person chooses to offend. However, not enough time and effort is put into supporting victims. Thoughts and prayers need to be replaced with solutions and action. Police are significant in helping some youthful offenders get the services they need. This new holistic approach of treating a person who is shoplifting because they are hungry the same way you treat a juvenile who intentionally commits a crime of violence is signaling to our youth that no matter the crime, they're going to have the same result. Grouping car thefts and carjacking as though they are remotely similar is doing a disservice to communities. These two examples do not offer our communities the best opportunity for intervention. Data-driven people often miss the overall impact of a results-driven approach. I'll give you an example. As a young police officer, I had a problem with students being robbed at the local corner store during school hours. I was tasked with increasing patrols and stopping robberies. After a short time, on paper, the data showed that the robberies stopped during the increased patrols. Still, the most important, impactful decision came from a results-driven approach in which we found out why students were leaving school in the first place to go to the store, and we offered those same options at the school store. Multiple problems were solved by digging deep into the problem without simply just looking at numbers. And I know a lot of people will tell you that certain demographic of people are targeted for arrest and things like that. But we, must look at things that actually are results driven and not just numbers driven. Some will say that we as police officers only want to lock up our youth or don't understand the law. I'm here to tell you that that narrative is false. It is our job to enforce the law without bias or prejudice. One of the main problems we're facing in policing is that our cops have to balance ensuring public safety and also remembering self-preservation. Every day we leave our homes to come to work, we're tasked at being perfect on every call. We're keenly aware of the multiple layers of review, from internal affairs, the local accountability boards, statewide boards, and also federal oversight. These reviews are intentionally constructed to, quote, hold cops accountable. This is an integral part of why juvenile arrests are down. Our officers watch the news, they read the papers, they listen to talk radio. I want to draw your attention to an article published in the Baltimore Sun on July 23rd, 2023. The article was titled, "Maryland Attorney General Seeks State Spending Board for More Staff to Prosecute Police Killings." Think about the pressure of making sure that you check every box to ensure that you're not the person in handcuffs at the end of an encounter. We support removal of bad cops from our profession. However, some of the recent reforms simply go too far as a means of oversight. Sadly, proactive policing has become a thing of the past. Responding to a call for service and writing a report is now acceptable by some. Our men and women stand willing and ready to act to defend our communities, but we need your support. I want to close with a few solutions as to the juvenile crime crisis that maybe we can start to see some movement in a positive direction. And I start with technology that plays a big role in how we do our jobs these days. Custodial interrogations of youth that are recorded and captioned on body-worn cameras can prove that confessions are not coerced. Simply allowing a judge to rule on the confession as part of a pretrial motion can go a long way to allowing our officers to get justice for victims and also protect the rights of those accused of crime. Return to the mandatory detention requests for youth that are accused of violent crimes. Next, increase monitoring of youth who are in community detention / home electronic monitoring. Next, allow juvenile probation officers to be a part of the school community to ensure compliance with conditions of release. Lastly, as far as recommendations, bring back the impact, intermediate, and enhanced programs within the Department of Juvenile Justice or Juvenile Services. These programs they offered wraparound services to youth in custody of DJS. These services were similar to inpatient care, but were specific for youthful offenders who have been found fact-sustained in a court by a juvenile judge or master. Places like the Charles Hickey School, Cheltenham, Waxter Center for Girls, and other DJS-run facilities should serve as a place to provide inpatient services. We encourage you to do, and as I close, I don't need the whole 12 minutes, but that is definitely welcome. We encourage you to do ride-alongs with the local jurisdictions that you serve and get a kind of feel for what our members are seeing all across the state. And with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I thank you for your time. And I'm definitely excited about the process of being a part of the solution. And I will stand for any questions that anyone may have.
All right, there are going to be several questions, starting with Delegate Taylor. Then I see Delegate Conway, Grammer, Kaufman. I'm going to try and keep it moving. Delegate Taylor.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Boatwright, for being here today. You named 5 or 6 recommendations. I couldn't keep track. Just wondering if you could provide those recommendations to us in writing.
Yes, ma'am. I'll make the recommendations, and this testimony, I'll make it available in writing.
Thank you.
Delegate Conway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Testify before we get to the police worn body cameras, which you know I was a sponsor of that. Are we talking about the ability of minors to waive their rights and be interrogated, and juvenile suspects to be interrogated without legal representation? Is that what we're talking about?
No, we're talking about if a person wants to talk, whether they're if a juvenile wants to talk to the police and he wants to give a confession, much has been talked about with some of the history of policing, and we look at some of the release of people who were found to have been coerced and given their confession, because technology has advanced so far, and we are, when you are dealing with a person in custody and you're having contact with that person, the body-worn camera is worn, so that can remove the doubt of whether or not the police officer coerce the person to give the voluntary statement.
So are you saying that a juvenile, a person's child, can talk to you on camera and waive their rights without their parents' permission? Is that what
simply the courts have held that issuing the Miranda rights is sufficient enough for a person if they understand their rights. If they don't want to talk, and all of the questioning stops once they say they want an adult present or attorney present, then the questioning stops at that point.
Thank you very much.
Let me
Yes,
follow
sir.
up on that question, then I'll go to Delegate Grammer. The issue, I think, is if the child is making a statement to a police officer and walks up to a police officer and says, "I just saw him with a gun," is that a custodial interrogation that triggers the law? The juvenile interrogation law?
I don't believe so, because that person is not suspected of committing a crime. That person is a witness at that point.
So if the police officer was wearing their body-worn camera and was filming as you suggest, they're filming the person, the child comes up there, that already can be, the police officer isn't stopped from talking to the child at that point.
Correct. Right. That person, the person that's a witness, that police officer can have as much dialogue as possible as they choose to have at that point. Yes.
Because it's not a custodial interrogation.
That person is not in custody.
Okay.
And they're free to go. Yes.
I think there's a perception out there that police officers can never talk to children. And in fact, that's something that has been said repeatedly, and that in fact, you'd agree that's incorrect, right?
I would agree. Yes.
All right.
I would agree that that's incorrect.
Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here today. This is an important issue for my district and frankly, the entire Baltimore region. Unfortunately for my district, this problem has existed for the entire time I've been in office, which is about 9 years. In the prior hearing on this issue, we talked to the Secretary of the Department of Juvenile Services, and he mentioned what he perceived as the reduction in juvenile crime in the state and the region across the country. He named a couple numbers: 2/3, 66%, 60%. And I want to start by asking you about that. When I talk to people who experience juvenile crime in my district, they will frequently elaborate about the circumstances. They will say things like, what we called, but an officer never showed up. An officer showed, but I never got a police report. We got a police report, but nobody was ever found. That was, the person who committed the crime was never found. Well, they found the person, but they didn't press charges. And if I'm completely off base and wrong here, please feel free to tell me. But part of the problem, the disparity we see with actual legitimate juvenile crime and the perceived numbers that Department of Juvenile Service is reporting, is in large part, to me, because there aren't currently enough law enforcement officers to frankly work these cases. And if I'm wrong, please tell me that, but can you touch on that point briefly?
Yeah, Delegate, you're right on board with right in the right direction with that. Just giving you an example of how an encounter happens if a police officer, makes contact with the juvenile who's accused of a crime. It's that officer's responsibility to take that juvenile to the Department of Juvenile Services. DJS then does an intake and they do an assessment to include the priors and things like that. And one of my recommendations I talked about at one point, whenever there was an allegation of a violent crime, there was automatically a big red stamp put on top of the paperwork that says detention request. We need to remove this person from the community to get them services. It's not about, in the juvenile justice system, it's not about juveniles doing time, quote unquote. It's about services that the Department of Juvenile Service Juvenile Services can offer. And ordinarily, they would not be able to get those services unless they are, in some cases, in custody for some of the acts that they have committed. And so when you talk about juvenile crime and the fact that our recruitment and retention for policing is very, very low. I know police departments, everyone's hiring. And it's about what police department, there was a time that you would have 300 applicants for 10 jobs, or in some cases more. But now, we'll have the jobs posted, and police departments are basically fighting who can give the best benefits, whether it's, the take-home car program or the retirement system or, cash bonus to come start here. So each police department across the state is using this opportunity to recruit, but, applicants now get to choose the department that they go to.
So a second question, more brief question. We've seen examples of prosecutors dropping not only juvenile crimes, dropping charges on juvenile crimes, but dropping charges not prosecuting violent crimes. Am I off base there? Because it seems that is a major contributor to, frankly, why we don't see a lot of these legitimate crimes come to the system.
So I don't think it's a thing of dropping the charges. It's what happens from the incident to the person going before a judge or a master. That's where we're seeing the problem. Once a person is taken into custody, a young person is taken into custody, and they go through that assessment with the Department of Juvenile Services, if they are released back to the community on electronic monitoring, they're now able to, if they choose to cut off the ankle bracelet or they just choose to not abide by the rules, they're now able to reoffend. And that's what we're seeing. The same young people are being released back to the community, supposed to have some sort of oversight, and they're now reoffending and doing the same crimes. I mean, I'm seeing reports from various media outlets, from parents begging law enforcement to, do something with my child. I can't control them. They don't listen. They leave. I mean, we had an incident in Baltimore County where this same young person, I think he was 11 years old, was stealing cars. And he just repeatedly stole cars, and when he was stopped by the police, first thing he says, "Are you taking me home to my mother? I'm 11 years old." He knows that he can get around the system.
Final question. When you talk to law enforcement, either frontline officers or leadership at a precinct, they'll be frank with you and they'll say, look, we're in a state of triage, basically. They'll elaborate about the things that they have to investigate, and they're trying to pick and choose what they can investigate with the resources they have. A lot of the charges that we see, we see everybody agree that there's an increase in crime on things like carjacking, handgun violations, vehicle theft. What doesn't seem to be reported accurately are minor assaults, property crimes, and it seems like there's kind of a layer of crime. Yeah, these things are minor, so either the police will triage those out, or DJS will just handle those, and the youth will be back in the community. But nobody's going to turn their head to carjacking or a handgun violation or a vehicle theft. And to me, like, all of these crimes are up,
Yes.
especially the small crimes, the property crimes, the crimes in the community that aren't necessarily violent, but residents feel kind of like they're happening more and more and more, and nothing's being done about it. And again, tell me if I'm off there, but am I correct in kind of perceiving a triage from frontline cops, local precincts, and that it's not necessarily the case that there is a reduction in juvenile crime and an increase in these more heinous acts? Is that the case?
Yeah, so I've spent the all summer, even though I'm in the role of state president and local president, I spent the summer in the uniform, responding to calls for service with my police officers in my jurisdiction, and I worked the juvenile curfew detail all summer long. And when we talk about youthful offenders and we speak to victims of crimes, the first thing the victim will say what's going to happen? What's the worst that can happen to this person if I file a report? And, we'll tell them, hey, it's out of our hands. Once we turn it over to DJS, takes over from there. And, the victims will say, well, you know what? If you can't arrest them, I'm not filing a report. So we now find people that just don't want to file reports because there's no way for them to get restitution for their property that was damaged. There's no way for anyone to be held accountable. And that's what I talked about in my opening statement, structure and accountability. If we go back to the days of holding people accountable for their offenses, then we can start to see a shift. Because then the word will get out. Because what's happening now is our young people are using social media such as Instagram, TikTok. They're using all of these various social media drivers in order to get likes and get followers. And some of these crimes are captured on these various social media sites. That helps us in prosecuting and understanding who did what. But it still does not, answer the questions that the victim have, because the victim is the one that's impacted by this. Whether it's an assault, there's a level of trauma that goes along with our victims. And that's why I talked about we need to spend more time focusing on getting our victim services and less time to talk about root causes. Root causes can come out and you can talk about issues with your parenting and your upbringing. You can talk about all of those things while you're in an inpatient or in custody program while you're getting the services that you need.
And my district perceives a lack of accountability too, but I appreciate the questions.
Thank you.
Delegate Kaufman.
Thank you, Officer Boatright. I appreciate you being here.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing.
Yeah, just
Technology gods aren't with us today. Hold on. Can you hear me now, Officer Boatright?
Oh, yes.
It's nice to meet you.
It's a pleasure.
My question is, I have two, but they'll be brief, Mr. Chair. My first question is, I understand that you're not fond of the law about, are you taking me to my mother because I'm not yet 12 or something like that. But you can always find an anecdote of a wiseacre kid, if you will, to prove your point. And so what I want to know is that how often that happens, because in my estimation, some kids today don't know who the Vice President of the United States is. So I have a hard time believing that they know the intricacies of Maryland law. So I appreciate that one kid was, a wiseacre, and you just said, you're taking me to my mother because I can't go to jail. But how often does it actually happen?
Oh, it's frequent. And again, I spent a lot of time, over 10 years, as a high school basketball coach in the city and at my alma mater. And the reason why that's important is I got to understand the limits of what our young people understand. And so consequence and accountability, they understand that. And when you have a young person that is accused of a crime, it's been my experience over the last 23 years and primarily working with young people is that they're not quote unquote dumb to the law. They understand and they understand right from wrong. That the intricate details of case law, me as a police officer, I don't understand all of that. And they don't necessarily understand the intricate details, but they know the basics that if I'm a certain age or if I commit a certain crime, these are the things that are going to happen to me, and I can get out and get on electronic monitoring, and I can be right back doing the same thing with you guys tomorrow. That's what they talk about in their small circles.
Okay. And my second and final question, Mr. Chair, if that's all right, is we, a couple months ago when we were on Zoom together, the gentleman, Mr. Secretary Vinny, thank you, talked about, juvenile crime is down. And you in your eloquent opening statement talked about how it was up, etc., and it's a major, and painted a totally different picture. And with all due respect to both you and the secretary, I don't know who to believe. So if you could please provide me with data or the committee with data at a later time to buttress your assertion, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you. And look, the secretary is relying on his numbers, and his numbers support reported juvenile crime. And so if you are seeing a difference with reported crime, but again, I talked about all summer long, working in communities and talking to the public, at least in Baltimore City, it is the perception of the members of the community that juvenile crime is up. And I can only go by what's reported by both my membership and my real-time assessments with talking with residents within the city of Baltimore.
Thank you for your service, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Vice
Yes, sir.
Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Officer Boatwright, good to see you.
Good to see you, W.
Just a few, first of all, let me thank you for clearing up with the chair the questioning question on when officers can question children. Thank you for clearing that up. And I believe you mentioned to some degree a level of training in your opening remarks. So my question is whether there is in training, how often is it, because, we change the law all the time, and how is it done? Is there a role play with, questioning so that officers can understand when they can and cannot ask questions?
Yeah, so I'm sorry.
I was done. I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so each year we have what's called a mandatory 40 hours of in-service training. And during in-service training, each department has the ability to form their own in-service training or join forces with other police departments. I know my police department we host in-service training. We have 4 different agencies that come in. And then during that in-service training, we do hold role-playing sessions. And the role-playing sessions are geared towards, in some cases, new laws that go into effect. It's usually held during the summertime, and how the changes impact our day-to-day as opposed to what we could do last year. So there is a level of training that goes on for every police officer that's required to take this training every year. And so I do see role playing as one of the things that we use on a yearly basis.
What time of year is that training done?
So for police departments of large sizes, like I'll use the Baltimore Police Department, I think they run in-service training classes every week in order to get through their whole department, because you have to take it every year. And so it's not solely based on new laws. It's a number of different things. You have to take your CPR certification. You have to take cultural bias, different things like that. You have to fit a number of different objectives in a block every year.
How often are adults convicted of car theft?
I'm not sure of that number.
How often are adults coercing children to commit car thefts?
I would say it's probably 50% of the time.
So we don't know how often the adults are being charged with car theft. I said convicted, I think, but let's go with charge, because you would have the charge numbers. So how often are adults charged with car theft?
Yeah, I would have to do the research.
Okay, that's fine. You said 50% when it comes to an adult coercing a child.
That's a personal assessment, just to be clear.
Yeah, I got
Okay.
you. I got you. That's fine, because the reason why I was asking, because there is a human and labor trafficking aspect to an adult, getting a child to commit a specific crime, only so that the child is not convicted and they can go back and do it again. So I wanted to kind of bring that up. Isn't that so? One more quick question, Mr. Chair, and then I'll be done. Actually, hopefully I'll be done. Okay. How do you learn a child's age when they are arrested, or when you approach them?
You ask them a question.
Right. So they say, I'm 11 years old, and you have to take them at their word, even though they may have just committed an offense?
So my department is a little unique. We have access to, if we'll ask a child, are you, what school do you go to? What's your name? And we can verify their age based off of school data. And we can, call another police department and say, hey, we have a 12-year-old that lives in Prince George's County. Do you guys have a database with all your school students just to verify this person's age? I mean, we do see young people that say that they're 14, but they look like they're 20 years old. And so there's a way to verify that.
That I was asking that question because I have not gone on a ride along, and I probably never will go on a ride along. I'm not trained for that type of activity. So that's why I wanted to know. I wasn't sure just how that is done. Truly my last question this time is, actually I'll make it a combo question. With respect to, you had juvenile curfew detail, but I don't think one of the solutions that you listed was juvenile curfew. Do you have any, do you find juvenile curfew to be effective at all?
I found, and this is just based on my assessment, working it, juveniles understood the places to not be during juvenile curfew.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, I have a couple more questions and then I'm gonna go. Simmons, well, now Delegate Tolles screwed up my system, but it's all right. Simmons, Phillips, Simpson, and then Tolles after I ask a couple questions. I want to go back to the process. You've made an arrest of a child and they're juvenile, and you're taking them to the DJS facility effectively. The officer has to write a report, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
So when you're writing a report, a few years ago, at least in the city, we created a computer. They provided a computer right there at booking, so that the officer can complete the report right there. Is that it?
That's still the case?
Still
Yes.
the case. If I have a sort of a technical question. If the officer has a computer in his car, can he also make the report from his car? I don't mean to be stupid.
No.
Is there something magical about that computer?
Yes. So the report at the booking facility is linked to the arrest booking, and for safeguarding reasons, you don't want that to be to protect that data. Juvenile data is very sensitive. And so if it's in a secure facility, and so especially juveniles that are in custody, you don't want that hacked or have everybody have access to it. So when you make it a juvenile arrest, you can write the initial offense report in your car or on your phone. But in order to do the charging that DJS needs to do an assessment, you have to go physically into the juvenile facility to do so.
Okay, that's helpful. And so you submit the report, you turn it in, and then DJS uses their tool to determine whether the child should be detained or not, at least under current procedures. And then they make their decision. As you said before, or at least I think I heard you say before, that when they start that process, that's sort of the end of the road. Is that right?
That's the end of the road for the police officer on the street, because he's now taken the report from the victim, developed the suspect, has probable cause to take the young person into custody, and now he has taken that young person to the Department of Juvenile Services, and DJS now handles the portion of once intake. They do the intake assessment, and then that young person is brought before a judge or a juvenile master to determine whether or not they are fact sustained or not.
But if they deny the petition, doesn't a police officer have the ability to appeal that decision to the state's attorney?
Correct. So, it's been a while since I've arrested a juvenile, but, we used to have every case, before you would lock your charges out, and this is the same for adults, you would communicate with the juvenile state's attorney to see if this is something that is eligible for a diversionary program, or other options outside of, in custody arrest. And so you will have that discussion and that assessment. Again, another tool that came, one of the things that comes into place is the juvenile's prior record. How many times has he offended, and the gap? If this person has just been arrested for car theft, carjacking 3 times within the last 6 months, that should be a detention request because the behavior has not changed. And that young person needs some other services that he's not getting because he's still offending.
I think that is a question for the Department of Juvenile Services. I don't question that. And one of the things in this committee's discussion and outside of this committee's discussion that I do think is becoming clearer is that there needs to be another look at the tool that's being used by the department to determine whether juveniles who are coming back again and again and again are triggering anything within the department to say, hey, wait a minute, this is somebody who's come back multiple times over a short period of time. But even still, if the department says no, the police officer, or in fact the victim, at least as I read it, and you don't have courts and judicial proceedings 38A10 in front of you, subsection H, but it says, sorry, you don't, and I'm just trying to be fair that he doesn't, and I don't want to play gotcha, but I also want to say, police officer does have the ability to go back and appeal that to the state's attorney. I would argue, particularly in those cases where you have a kid that's coming back through the system again and again. That is a tool that you have, isn't that right?
Yeah, I would agree.
Okay. We'll go to Delegate Simmons, Delegate Phillips, Delegate Simpson, then Delegate Tolles.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Rather, Mr. Boatwright. So first of all, knowing the challenges that law enforcement officers face on a daily basis when it comes to patrolling and communicating with our residents here in the state of Maryland, the challenges that are before the law enforcement officers, I want to briefly go over some concerns or issues that we often do not talk about that may be contributing factors to the problems that we're having in juvenile crimes. One of them, can you tell me briefly, how much time do a law enforcement officer spend in learning constitutional law?
Initially, that's a number of objectives with constitutional law during entry level, during the police academy. And we have frequent, as I talked about earlier, with in-service training, we get regular updates as to changes in constitutional law, both locally, statewide, and federal.
Okay, so on an average, would you say it's more than 2 weeks, more than 6 months, less than?
Over a period of a career, it's more than 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things else is when we talk about juvenile crimes and we talk about the times that crimes are being committed, we often do not talk about the fact that we have a huge increase in truancy with our schools and how we work with our schools to face and address young people and where they're at and where they should be. Can you talk about any communications or relationship you have with the school system to enforce and also support efforts to keep kids in school?
From my perspective, and I left this out in my intro, my primary police department that I'm a police sergeant in is the Baltimore City School Police Department. It's the only school police department in the state of Maryland. And I know I've been there for 21 years, going on 21 years. When I initially started at school police, we had a truancy unit. In fact, I did a lot of work with the truancy unit because of the school assignment that I had housed the truancy unit in it. So I was like their primary contact. And over time, the truancy units, at least in Baltimore City, has slowly dissolved. Not much attention from a law enforcement perspective is put on truancy. However, from an administrative perspective, I think my home agency, Baltimore City Schools, does an excellent job getting the administrators and other people involved in young people that are truant and doing home visits and other things like that. So I do see it from both sides. It's less of a law enforcement thing and a legal thing, and it's more of an administrative thing that we have been slowly taken out of the fold of.
Absolutely. So would you know if there's an increase in parents seeking assistance from the courts when it comes to kids that are kind of what we would consider out of control or not compliant with their parents' requests? Also, dealing with the schools, and you said you work within the schools, the SRO program, as we grow it here in the state of Maryland. Can you talk a little bit about how they're used in the school system that may contribute to a high number of juveniles being incarcerated or arrested during the school day?
So we can certainly talk about that. Going back as far as 2015, 2016, we looked at arrest data, and juvenile arrest data from a school perspective is significantly low. I worked, again, I told you I've been there going on 21 years. I remember a time we were making 1,000 arrests a year of young people. And that number has consistently been under 100 for the last 4 years or 5 years or so, because we've started focusing on not getting involved in the administrative day-to-day, not getting involved in student discipline. We're focusing on quality of arrests as opposed to quantity of arrests. We don't arrest for things such as disorderly conduct. We don't arrest for failure to obey a lawful order. These were all things that under previous administrations were arrestable offenses. And it was some of the things that officers used as a tool because they were allowed to, under the law, to take people into custody and have them answer for those charges. We simply just don't do that anymore. And I don't think any school district across the state is using that tool, the tool of arrest, to impact the schools day to day.
With the SROs, and like I said, in reference to young people being detained, I noticed that one of the things that was occurring when I worked at Anne Arundel Medical Center here, that there was a large number of young people being brought in by the police and put on mental health holds. Because we did not have the capacity of housing young people in the jails. So they was brought to hospitals and put in 72-hour holds, which really did not have any medical situation other than a temper tantrum or when they was acting out in that moment, and did not rise to the point of where a hospital would keep them unless there was an order from the officers. So just kind of how we looking at what we consider to be someone in custody or someone that's detained and not able to proceed of their own free will is another area that we have to look at. We opened up, I think Vice Chair talked about ride-alongs, and just recently, since coming into office in January, I've done 2 ride-alongs. Recently, last Friday, my whole staff is required to do ride-alongs. And just myself as a former law enforcement officer, I think it's important to keep everything relevant and in perspective. Their takeaway was that of their interaction with a young man and his mom who was living in the woods. He was 10 years old. And when we look at how mental health and homelessness play into these numbers of people that are being incarcerated or people that are acting out that rise to the point where a law enforcement officer have to take them into custody, it's about services that we're not providing to our communities. And we're leaving too much for our law enforcement officers to figure out in the field or to mitigate in the field. So as we talk about all of these things that are coming up, and everyone is always talking about juvenile crime, even though juvenile crime probably reflects about only 7% of crime, in total. So we don't talk about the 93% of adults that are we focus on young people and we vilify them and we make people afraid of them. And then that puts everybody on edge, including law enforcement officers, because we have a problem in our state with guns. And those law enforcement officers have families too, and they intend to go home too. We saw that in the Brooklyn Homes situation where we had a delay in response because of the threat of violence and safety. So I would just remind everybody here that the idea is to find out how we can collectively. Yes. So my question would be, from a law enforcement perspective, do you feel that y'all are doing all that y'all can to mitigate crime and juveniles?
I will say we're using the tools that are available to us. And I think that you open the door to something that we see in real time as it relates to the emergency petitions that are as we categorize it in my department amongst our officers, that is the new arrest, as opposed to young people being taken to juvenile justice. They are being taken, I guess, record numbers to hospitals for evaluations.
Thank you.
With respect to Delegate Simmons, and we have adjoining districts in Brooklyn Homes, and we've both seen quite a bit since the events of early July there. So I don't mean, I'm sorry to slow your roll just a little bit, but at the same time, I want to make sure everybody gets their questions. All right, you're just warming up. That's right. Get a couple test swings. That's all right. That's fine. But we like questions. All right, that's fine. Delegate Phillips, please, then Simpson, then Tolles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. this is an issue that many of us are grappling with when it comes to juvenile justice related matters in our districts. I've spent a considerable amount of time. I'm collecting data. I've asked the Baltimore County Police Department for loads of data. And I'm sure at some point they will be sharing data publicly because I'm sure people are going to ask them for it. But the information that I've received to date, in my mind, suggests a couple of things. That juvenile crime is up, that particularly in the areas of theft, whether it's retail or car theft. In the process, there was a process set out as we looked at reforming the juvenile justice laws. And the police department was a participant in that process. It predates me, but the police department was a participant in that process. One of the things that we seem to be hearing, Mr. Boatwright, is that you cannot police as you have in the past. And I want to make sure I'm clear. So first, starting with the Juvenile Interrogation Act, what is it, and you've made some recommendations, what is it that you see we should do differently? And why different than you would treat an adult?
So to answer that question, it's simply you would not treat a juvenile. I mean, you would treat a juvenile differently than an adult because we understand as law enforcement, you're dealing with the adolescent mind. So you have to speak plain English and make sure that you're communicating clearly so that the young person understands what's going on. Because a lot of times, again, as a person that has primarily worked with adolescents, I understand that they're in some cases, if this is their first encounter with police, they're scared. So sometimes you have to, bring down the temperature a little bit and get them to understand that you are there to support them through this process. Again, the difference between adults and juveniles, adults do time, juveniles do programs. That's why in the recommendations, we talked about the intermediate, the impact, and the enhanced programs, because they're 30, 60, and 90-day programs for young people that continue to reoffend. First offenses, you can get away with sending a young person back home, but when they continue to reoffend, then they need additional services. And it's up to us in the professional setting as law enforcement to have these young people understand that, hey, you need a little bit more help than what you're getting.
Let me ask you, are you suggesting that we can't, through this process, refer children to those services?
I think we should. We should.
But I'm asking you, what is different today than was different 2022?
Again, when you have a violent crime or certain types of offenses, it was an automatic red stamp across the top of the paperwork. I did it as a booking officer, detention request. That's telling everybody that's going to handle this paperwork that this allegation is so serious that this person needs additional support. And what's happening, again, once it goes back to DJS, whoever does the intake or whoever does the assessment, they get to choose the path that this case is going to go and the path that the young person is going to go. So again, that's different than how you would handle an adult. When you arrest an adult, you take them to the jail or facility, you speak to the state's attorney's office, and the state's attorney's office gets to determine whether or not the charges are filed or whether or not they continue on with the case. There's a different layer in juvenile cases than it is with an adult.
So outside of the under 13, those are the 13 to 17, that process is not truly changed. Is that correct?
It's not changed, but it's not, again, the intake assessment is what's changing. Again, the time between when they arrive at the facility and they met with the intake worker of DJS and the time they go before a judge or a juvenile master, that is where we're seeing the gap. Because again, the same young people are reoffending. They're right back out on the street. There's no consequences. There's no determination to hold them, to give them services. They're just released back into the community. And in some cases, they are on the electronic monitoring. But as we talked about with Brooklyn Day and all of this, and I don't want to highlight that situation, but two people that were taken into custody both had ankle monitors on, and they both had guns, and they were shooting at each other or shooting at other people. So they were back in the community with an electronic monitoring system to reoffend. So where is the follow-up? That's what we're talking about, the follow-up, having the right people that if you're a young person and you violate the terms of your electronic monitoring, you're taken back into custody. That's, if you're not going to school, if you're not going to get the services, if you need counseling, if you're not taking your medication, all of those things have to factor in. If you're failing drug testing, all of these things, which are conditions of release, we need stronger follow-up on.
And I get that. So I'm just trying to make sure, I'm trying to figure out if there is a failure in the legislation, or is there a failure in the process?
Well, I think
in the flow as it has been established. And I'm looking at a flow chart, and that flow chart definitely gives police the detention to the opportunity to request detention. It gives the juvenile services an opportunity to do a referral if it's required. So it seems to me that the process that was outlined, and I may be wrong, so that's what I'm trying to understand. So I shouldn't make a judgment. Is it the process? Is it the enforcement? What is broken?
I would say that question is better for people that are impacted and directly impacted by this. Why it's not a question for police? Because if a judge decides to release, or a jury decides to release a person, and they come back on the street and we have to deal with them for 365 straight times over a course of a year, that is our job, to deal with them. And if they have an allegation against them, we'll take them into custody and bring them before a judge again. That's our role. So whoever is impacted by that, they can tell you whether or not that it's a clog in the system or is a clog in the law. Our job is to just take the information that we're given on a crime scene, make a professional assessment. Do we have enough probable cause? And then bring that person before a judge to have to be adjudicated. That's our only role.
So one of the questions that I asked my local jurisdiction is, as a result of the reforms, how often do the police refer children to children in need of supervision? I still haven't quite gotten the exact number, but anecdotally, my sense is that number has not risen. It seems to me that if there was an option, that is an option that would be used. Is there a reason, if my thought is correct, is there a reason why police are not using that as an alternative?
I wouldn't say that police are not using it as an alternative. I think what we're now questioning is what happens after that recommendation is made. What is the next step? What happens to the youthful offender, and what happens to the victim in this case?
Do you have an idea of the statistics, between 2022 versus 2023? Has the fraternal order looked at that?
No, we haven't. No.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
No, I have a couple questions to riff off of this a little bit. So again, he doesn't have the annotated code. Surprisingly, Mr. Boatwright doesn't carry the annotated code with him when he goes out of town. And I don't know how. I find that outrageous, really. But having said that, although I don't either, the stamp, the stamp that says detention, and this is, current law says if a complaint is filed that alleges the commission of an act which would be a felony if committed by an adult, or alleges a violation of I think this is a wear carry under the criminal law article, and the possession of antique guns, which is kind of an interesting, I think, section to have in there. And if the intake officer denies authorization to file a petition or proposes an informal adjustment, the intake officer shall immediately forward the complaint to the state's attorney, or forward a copy. So first, so that there is already in current law clearly a process that says if they've been at least charged with a felony, which would cover the most serious violent crimes, that those cases would be forwarded to the state's attorney's office. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. I guess the question and what I've heard you talk about on a couple different occasions and going to Delegate Phillips' questions from it comes back to the decisions that are made when cases are brought to the Department of Juvenile Services, and then they make their decision. And what, at least from my perspective, and I think this is in part what you're saying, that part of the challenge is it's sort of a problem within DJS where they're not looking at whether the children, the juveniles, are coming through the system over and over again, and it results them being returned to the street. That isn't really the function of a change in the law. That's a function in DJS policy. Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, I think that's where we need to look. And for full disclosure, prior to becoming a police officer, I worked for the Department of Juvenile Justice, as it was named back then. And I recall these programs. That's why I was able to talk about the enhanced program, the impact program, the intermediate program. And I remember those facilities such as Cheltenham and Alfred Noyes down in Montgomery County and Waxter Center down in Laurel for girls. And now the DJS building down on 300 North Gay Street. To know that there was a period of time that these programs were available and services were rendered almost the equivalent on an inpatient level for juvenile justice, and we're just not seeing those young people we're not seeing young people today get the same kind of services that could probably shift the behavior, that could probably intervene in a young person committing, because what's happening, we're now starting to see escalating behaviors. The quote unquote Kia boys and the whole thing, whether it's Hyundais and Kias and Acuras and Virginia tags and how they steal cars using the USB. Well, those behaviors are now escalating into carjackings, which is a total different thing.
All right, I'm going to go Delegate Simpson, then Tolles, then Pester.
Good afternoon, Mr. Boatwright. Thank you
Good
so much for
afternoon.
being here today. I really appreciate it. Where I'm going, we keep talking about really young children that are doing these crimes. And I'm wondering about, please share with me, what type of safety assessment are you doing on these children to determine if this is the child or someone else that's behind it? You mentioned about that these kids understand what they are doing. We know that even young children, like toddlers, developmentally can memorize and repeat back. Doesn't mean they truly actually understand what it is that they are doing. So and there seems to be this huge assumption that we are getting the right kids, that these are the kids who committed these crimes without, how do you know that that particular child committed that crime? There seems to be a huge assumption, just because there's an allegation, just because we've arrested someone multiple times and traumatized them in the system. How are we sure that it is that child, and what type of safety assessment is done to determine, like our vice chair had said, that this is not more of a child trafficking type of issue?
So if there is evidence, and this is a case by case basis, if there's evidence, if you see, if you look at the history of that particular child, and if they're only stealing one type of vehicle, let's say we've arrested across 3 jurisdictions this same juvenile 5 times in the last 2 years, and each time he was caught in a Mercedes-Benz. As a police officer, that's going to tell me that he's probably trying to get that stolen car to a chop shop, which is probably tied to more of an organized crime. But that assessment can only be done if you have the information available. So there's an assumption that a lot of these crimes are tied to organized. A lot of these situations are tied to organized crime. Well, that's what, you know, you need police officers and people dedicated to conduct that follow-up, to look deeper into these various cases. I'm talking about what we see as far as, you know, robberies. Robberies are up because they're a crime of opportunity. And that's because, you know, you try to tell people not to be in dimly lit areas and watch your surroundings and things like that. When people commit this is not tied to some, you know, large gang that's saying, hey, I need you to rob 10 people tonight. No, this is, hey, look at him. He has on this. I want to take that from him, and I have a gun, and I can do it because if I get caught, nothing's going to happen to me. I'll be back out of here tomorrow, and I get to do the same thing. So I think that more of an assessment needs to be done. And sometimes that's outside of the purview of a patrol officer to determine what services a child could be needing based off of an encounter with an arrest. Now, if the young person is telling you that they need, look, I don't have a place to stay, I was just, you know, stealing something out of a store. Again, now we're treating a person that's stealing to survive differently than someone who has decided to arm themselves and put a gun in someone's face and take their property. They need to be treated differently. And so now you start to, hey, I need to get involved in this because this young person was caught stealing food. So this needs to be looked at a little bit deeper, but we can't all automatically assume that it's tied to organized crime. We have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
So what about false confessions, that just because a child has been arrested multiple times, does that really mean that that child committed those acts?
No, you have to take in policing, you have to use probable cause before you make an arrest. You have to have probable cause, reasonable, you know, it's bigger than a reasonable articulable suspicion. That's something different. That allows you to conduct an investigation. Once you have probable cause, such as cell phone camera video, surveillance camera video, you catch the person in the car, driving the car, you know, then you have probable cause. Just to assume, hey, let's just round up a juvenile and put a charge on them, that should not be happening, whether it's an adult or a juvenile or anybody. You can't do that in policing. And so you have to lean on doing a proper investigation. Again, we're not talking about quantity of arrest. We're talking about quality of arrest. And make sure that you have a good case that you can present to the state's attorney's office so that they can go forward and get justice for the victim. Because again, these are not victimless crimes. Having your car stolen with your valuables in it. When I see the conditions of these vehicles that are stolen, the amount of marijuana, the amount of cigarettes, the amount of things that are in these cars, and they're turned over to people that are non-smokers, and now they can't get that smell out of their car. They are impacted. There's a level of trauma there. They have been victimized. And so who's going to seek and who's going to speak for the victims is the question that we still continue to ask.
Thank you. I think we would agree. We want to help you with the quality and not the quantity and the accuracy.
Delegate Tolles and Delegate Pasture, and then we're going to move to our next panel. Delegate Tolles.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. He's virtual. Oh, it's late. Oh no. I know. I'm acting like this is my first rodeo. I know. I'm sorry. So I was going to say that I, agree that, our juveniles do know what they're doing. Folks have heard me say that before. And I agree that our adults know what they're doing when they send out juveniles to commit these crimes. And there does need to be consequences, because here we are, we have a responsibility to the community. So that's the hard job that we have. How do you legislate something like this? So I appreciate your comments. And could you name, you talked about it again, the inpatient services and facilities that are available. And you kind of touched on that how these programs and services used to be rendered, but not rendered anymore. So I'll be curious to see how we can monitor that going forward. And I have Cheltenham and Prince George's. Could you just briefly tell me what, oh, doesn't have to be brief or not, but could you tell me what the curfew is for, do you know what the juvenile curfew fine is?
No, I don't know the offhand. I would have to,
$50?
It's almost like traffic law. When we get a traffic violation, we have a booklet that's provided by the district court. We have to go through and find a violation, and that will be the same for curfew. Like if we are going to give someone a citation, we would just look it up and write it out.
Can you briefly tell me what that process is to give the curfew? I mean, to give the citation, like if you see a 12-year-old out at 10 o'clock at night, what's your process for that?
So what we did this summer is we gave warnings, and we looked for people who were unsupervised and in certain areas that were designated, and we did not, and we gave them an option. Hey, listen, you're violating the curfew at 11 p.m. You're under the age of 16. So you can speak to one of the intake workers or curfew workers. And we did this as a team. The first encounter was never the uniformed police officer. It was always the people that offer wraparound services. They would give them a warning. They would, allow them to go home. What we were finding, and just me being a part of both the initial curfew violations from maybe 10 years ago to now, we've seen a shift. At one point, police were just grabbing all juveniles and charging, and bringing them in with the curfew law. And sometimes you got good kids get caught up. I mean, I recall scenarios where, kids were coming from work or they were standing on their neighbor's porch. Well, I recall, 10 years ago, they had a young person that had the cordless phone in his hand. So he was literally on his porch. And so you had to, tell people you can't just round up all of the juveniles. You have to give them an opportunity to go home. And so that's what, we did primarily this summer. And that was just communication and engagement. We started to see the same people down at the harbor, to which they started, to know our names and, hey, Boatwright, how you doing? Hey, we going home. We're going to get on the bus. I know back when I was a teenager, the buses had numbers, and so now they're colors. So they were like, yeah, I'm going to get on the green and go home. So they knew that the law was in effect, and they communicated with us. So that process is always started by people that are non-police. And then when you have a person that continues to reoffend, then more services are added.
And you take them to a facility?
If they want to go. And the facility is just, curfew centers that have additional resources, and an intake assessment is done there to determine whether or not the child needs more support than they may be getting outside of the curfew center. I think, I'm sorry?
It's not jail. That's what
it's not jail. No, it's not jail.
Okay. All right. Well, that's something we have to explore in the coming months. How do you deal with juvenile curfew law? So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Pastor, then Delegate Crutchfield, and then we will be done with this part of the panels. Okay. Delegate Pastor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Good afternoon.
Oh, right. Thank you for being here. Let me make sure I have this piece correct. You are the president of the FOP?
For the state of Maryland, yes.
The state of Maryland.
Yes.
And for your job, you have been a Baltimore City school officer, correct?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to tell us what you know about juveniles that the average police officer on the street doesn't know about juveniles in general, because they are the ones who more often than not are going to deal with them when there is an issue or something has gone wrong. Now, I'm going to tell you that I'm asking the question because I do maintain, and since Baltimore City does this, and I like it, that those who are around children on a regular basis, seeing all of the people that they can be at any one or two times, know some things that officers who are on the street don't know about children when they have to interact with them when there are some misbehaviors. So again, I'm asking you what you think you know about how to approach and interact with children, whatever grade level they're on up to 12, that the average police officer might not know.
So that's falls directly under my purview as the leader of the Fraternal Order of Police, is to get messaging out, messaging to our members, our 21,000 members. And that messaging, we talk about these things in our meetings, and we encourage our trustees and our presidents to share messaging. And when it relates to juveniles, the one thing that we found to be successful as far as my police department that I work for, it's all about relationships. There's the pastor in the city of Baltimore, he has a saying, Pastor P.M. Smith, if it ain't about relationships, it ain't about nothing. And so that's a mindset that our police department has. It's building relationships and protecting our future. So that's one of the things that we do. We just have, I guess, patience. That's one of the things I preach to our members when dealing with young people. Again, some of them are scared. Some of them are very manipulative. But you just have to have a little bit of patience, and having patience with them, you'll start to see that the relationship, again, I always think back to 15-year-old me in the 21217 zip code of Sandtown, Winchester, West Baltimore. That's or I think to my 17-year-old son, if I'm going to be the law enforcement officer engaging with my son, how do I want someone to treat my son? And so these are conversations that we have on a regular basis, and I'm glad that I have the platform to spread those messages amongst our members. And again, in our profession, I look, and it's not just in Baltimore. I look, and I frequently hang out with police throughout the state of Maryland, and to see how they respond to calls for service that involve juveniles, as it relates to whether or not they are offenders or victims of crimes. I do see compassion, and I don't see a bully type of mentality that some people may believe it's out there because there's less interaction with young people. I do not see that because I think the officers get the message that this could be their child, and how would you want a police officer to engage with your child?
So I think that you would agree when I say that a piece of what the school police officer does and the way he interacts also has a lot to do with the administration. So we're real clear that your job is not to do the administrator's job.
That's correct.
Things that are supposed to be that person's must stay as that person. But you told or suggested nicely that maybe we could take some ride-alongs. Now, I've done, as a school administrator, and real ride-alongs as a former law enforcement officer, more than my share of ride-alongs. Okay. But I want to suggest, as the vice chair said, and I'm probably getting ready to misquote it. Did you say it's not in my training? It's not in my, whatever that was you said. I can say DNA. We'll go to the tape. Okay, let's go to the tape. But I'm agreeing with her, but in the reverse. And I'm going full circle back to the question I just asked you. Some of the police officers who are on the streets, who deal with young people, would do well doing an in school along. So since you are the president of the FOP and you have the knowledge because you're in that space, how nice it would be for if sometimes some of the officers, and I have just an inordinate amount of respect for anybody, particularly, I didn't have to wear a uniform, but there's a lot of stress when you go out every day in a uniform. You are a walking target for any number of things. So it might be nice sometimes if people feel like what is happening with our young people is escalating. We can't even call a PAL center anymore. So maybe if there was some opportunity sometime for them to come into a school and see what it is that the school officers do, of whom I know many, what they do and how the interaction is different. It just gives another insight, which takes me to the whole notion of training. So in that other life, I did a lot of training around the country. And what I know is this, and have been trained a lot, that there is a difference between when you sit in a classroom and when you're maybe out on the police department's campus or whatever, whether it's shooting or fighting or questioning, etc., when you know who the players are, than when you are in a real life situation. You know that. Would you agree with that? That it is different when you're in the real world as opposed to when you're in that training environment?
Yes, real world situations.
For a while.
I just said,
With
do you
love to
agree with
Delegate
that?
Pastor.
I said, do you agree? with
Okay,
that?
that's
But you have to set up the question.
mercifully. Yes, thank you
do?
very much.
Come on, Mr. Boatwright.
Yes, I would agree that training is different than real world situations.
All right, so how do you bridge that? What kinds of things can you change in terms of the training that would give that officer just a little bit more of a leg up?
So when the simple answer to that is, if you are a police officer currently, you're doing the work of 4 people. And it's not 4 separate job descriptions. You're doing the work of 4 different police officers because of, the fact that we're so short. I know I hear a lot of talk about people want to go to officer friendly and the walking the beat and things like that. Unfortunately, because policing is across the board, we have so many vacancies. There is less opportunity to get out and walk the beat. But I'll tell you this. Our officers across the state of Maryland develop relationships that go unnoticed. And it's not based off of a negative encounter. It's just the fact of seeing people every day. Some are not PG-13, so I can't say what they are now, but the nicknames that our police officers get, and it's usually based on a physical appearance or the fact that the officer has big feet or funny looking hair. The nicknames that are given to our police officers are terms of endearment by members of the community. And it's not necessarily based off a negative encounter. And sadly, where we've evolved as a profession, our young people understand that the officers on the street have the best interests in heart for our communities when they see our police officers responding to the scenes of shootings that are now again something that's changed in at least the 23 years that I've been a police officer. Now we carry tourniquets on our duty belts, and I when I'm on the street, I have a red bag with an AED and chest seals and all of the different things that a combat medic needs in order to treat someone or triage someone that's been a victim of a crime. And in some cases, it's these young people that have these relationships with our police officers that see that the officer is there to help them because they are experiencing a traumatic event. So I don't want it to be missed that there isn't a relationships with police officers that work the street and that we that primarily work with young people in schools are the only one that develop relationships. I think it's across the board, and it's just a different type of relationship, and that's because we're within that community, that school community, for 8 to 9 hours a day, and so you have more interaction.
And that's what I wanted to hear from you. It's about relationships.
It's about relationships, yes, ma'am.
Easily.
Yes.
All right, Delegate Crutchfield, and then Delegate Conway promised me it's a short question. All right, Delegate Crutchfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sergeant Boatwright, thank you for being here and making your presentation today. I appreciate the recommendations you've presented. I probably have now sat through about 3 or 4 briefings involving crime and young people. And I just have this nagging question, which is, I know the motto of law enforcement is to protect and serve. And I just constantly think about the service piece. And why is there so much resistance in helping young people by filing petitions, by doing anything that could help a child, such as what was earlier mentioned by Delegate Phillips, which is to file a child in need of supervision form. In my county, I come from Montgomery County, there has been only one filed by police officers in over 6 years. Can you just answer that question for me? What is the resistance? And you sort of brushed over it as well when Delegate Phillips mentioned this. So I'd like to just get, your understanding why this isn't done.
So I don't think it's a resistance. I think it's, police officers want the best tools. In fact, I'm in Arizona right now with a company that's on the forefront of creating the future of policing with technology, and we want more tools. And so if it's widely explained, if the referral process, I know I used to do them all the time for crimes that did not arise to an arrest. We used to simply refer it and to teen court, refer it to DJS or different programs. We had those programs that we can just write the paperwork and send it in for follow-up. So I don't think that there's a resistance in law enforcement for an additional tool. It's about educating the masses. 17,000 active police officers in the state of Maryland. You have to educate them and on why this option could be available and why it would be an alternative to an arrest. And so again, I've heard that this petition is available, but I think it's more about education than it is a resistance.
So, Sergeant, would you be willing to take that on, to take that as something to make sure it gets done as far as training goes?
So, in my role,
yes,
I'm limited. I can't tell a police chief or a sheriff with.
I understand that, but at least you can make a recommendation, right? Just like you're doing here today.
Yes. I mean, that's something that I would like to explore a little bit more, because again, we want as many tools as we can have in the toolbox. And the whole goal, again, with the protect and serve piece, as law enforcement officers, we want, whether it's a victim or a person that's accused of a crime, we want them to get the services that they need. Again, I want to hammer this home so that it's very clear from law enforcement. We don't want juveniles locked up doing time. That's not our position. It's not our role. Juveniles that are accused of a crime need services. Adults that are accused of a crime need to be held accountable and need to be sent to jail. That's a strong position, but there's a difference because everyone has redeemable value. But when you are a certain age and the law has established that, if you didn't know better, you should have known better. So that's why we have a different tier system between adults and juveniles. We want to see juveniles get the ability to correct that behavior and redirect their energy into things that are positive so they can be productive members of society. And so that's a blanket statement from law enforcement. And we just don't want it to be misconstrued that we just want to grab everybody, lock them up and put them in a wagon and haul them away. That couldn't be further from the truth.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Delegate Conway.
Sure. In reference to how do you want the police officer to engage with your child? First of all, my child wouldn't be guilty if they're accused. I thought they were innocent until they were proven guilty. But under an encounter by arrest, what are the parental rights? Does a parent have the right to say that anything that my child said, my juvenile child said, shall be stricken from the record because I didn't give them permission to make those statements and their attorney was not there? That's my question. What's my parental rights?
I strongly support parental rights. As a father of 3 and a grandfather of now 4, I strongly support parental rights, and I'm quite sure that my membership strongly support parental rights. But sadly, As you heard in the last hearing, our friends over at the public defender's office, they made it clear that they're not there for parental rights. They're there for the best interest of the child. And so I would encourage, a judge or a master, whoever's overseeing that case, to ensure that the law is adequately and accurately applied. And we as police officers have to live with it either way. And we're okay with that.
One last thing, and I want to go back to Montgomery County a little bit. I don't represent Montgomery County, but one of the issues that's come up fairly consistently but I'll go back to one of the questions that Delegate Crutchfield just asked with regard to the SINS process. I think there are two pieces to this. One is whether police officers engage in the SINS process, and with that, I associate myself with Delegate Crutchfield. But the other thing that I've heard that is a little more concerning, and I think goes to, and this is going to be an isn't that so question, and I'm going to get a note in my file from everybody in the committee, and it'll be fine. But for the DJS, their responsibility to bring one of those cases forward, my understanding is that is where there has been one case in about a decade that has come forward and gone into the juvenile system. So it's a little bit of both of those things, and I think that there's a process issue within DJS. Isn't that so?
I would agree with you, Deli. Mr. Chairman.
Now the ranking minority member would like to ask a question, and then we really have to move on.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I actually just asked for one sentence. Sir, thank you so much for bearing with us today. Thank you for serving and protecting our communities, and we really appreciate you being here with us.
Thank you.
Stop doing my job. All right, thank you very much. That'll conclude the remarks from Sergeant Boatwright. Thank you very much for being here and taking time to be with us virtually today. And now, Mr. Maroney, if you would come forward, please, from the Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit, which is within the Office of the Attorney General. Mr. Maroney provided an overview years ago when I first started as chair. Has been doing this job for quite a long time in the monitoring unit, so I'm happy to have him here today and to say a couple words. We will hear from you for 12 minutes. Feel free to use less, and then we'll take questions. Ms. Maroney, please.
Thank you so much, Chair Klippinger. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Vice Chair. Good afternoon, members of the committee. Just by way of a bit of background, my name is Nick Maroney, and I'm here to speak on conditions of confinement on behalf of the Juvenile Justice Monitoring Unit, which is part of the Attorney General's office. JJMU monitors conduct unannounced visits to guard against abuse and examine whether or not young people in DJS-operated detention and placement facilities are receiving appropriate treatment and services. We issue quarterly public reports on conditions of confinement that include responses from those folks who are supposed to provide the services. The unit was formed at a time of widespread systemic abuse, and we've driven systemic changes that produce positive outcomes for young people and enhance public safety. Point of clarification here, youth facing the most serious charges related to crimes of violence cannot be housed in DJS detention facilities and are instead held at adult jails and at the Corrections Agency-run youth jail in Baltimore City. And these facilities are outside the jurisdiction of the JJMU. Short-term service provision has traditionally been the norm and the focus at DJS detention centers because children and young people charged as juveniles are typically held for a few days to a few weeks before court decisions are actually made, whereas those charged as adults are held in secure detention for several months or sometimes up to a year awaiting court decisions from the criminal justice system. While youth facing the most serious charges cannot be held in DJS facilities, the majority of youth charged as adults can be in DJS detention facilities. And now they comprise over 50% of the DJS securely detained youth population. Sometimes at Baltimore City Juvenile Justice Center, at the bottom of that complex, the percentages are 60% adult charges, 40% youth charged as juveniles, for example. Whether charged as a juvenile or charged as an adult, securely detained young people in DJS facilities are isolated from loved ones, and from sources of social support, and they miss out on opportunities in their schools and in their communities. Detention centers have never been equipped to provide youth with individualized help or support. Taking BCJJC and picking on that facility again as an example, there isn't even any appreciable outdoor space there for incarcerated young people to get regular fresh air, no matter how long they're there. During a recent JJMU visit to a DJS detention center, a youth had a long conversation with a monitor about the circumstances that led to him being detained. His mother died of COVID-19 while he was living in another state. He was sent to Maryland to live with his dad, who he didn't know very well. He was a diligent student before the pandemic, but shifting to virtual instead of in-person school, in addition to adapting to a new school environment, was a major struggle for him. He became disengaged with his education and began hanging out with negative peers to squelch feelings of isolation and grief. When asked what supports he needed to thrive, he said family therapy to help him form a bond with his dad, grief counseling, and a religious mentor he could meet with regularly in person, as religion had been a source of positive support and structure for him in the past. He wanted to be able to attend school virtually through his community school and to receive individualized academic tutoring to help him with the one class he needed to complete to graduate. Unfortunately, detention is not equipped to provide any of these services to this kid, this youth, or really any individualized services for any young person. Each kid has a unique story and circumstantial background that led to their present circumstances. But this particular young person is just one of many facing several months or even a year of incarceration before he finds out whether he will be treated as a child who needs services and support and placed on a path, hopefully, to access some services, or if he will be treated as an adult criminal actor. The detention and placement centers operated by DJS have always held a disproportionate number of young people of color and youth from families with little financial means when compared with overall state population demographics. Our unit regularly receives emails and phone calls from worried parents asking if they can place their kids in detention. When we explore the motivation behind these frantic pleas for help, parents say their kids are struggling with mental health issues, with trauma, with grief, unsafe influences or living conditions, substance abuse, or sexual exploitation, or sexual exploitation. They believe that juvenile jail or juvenile prison is the only setting they might be able to access where their child might be relatively safe and receive some services. It's a tragic state of affairs when parents of Maryland families believe the only option for their kids to receive help or intervention is through incarceration. This situation tells us we have major structural deficits in the service availability for struggling young people and their families in Maryland communities. And this brings me to what I believe is an unexplored area of consensus among system stakeholders, and that is a shared recognition that something needs to be done to bolster the ability of the Department of Juvenile Services to better serve youth and communities, as well as enhancing public safety. We understand the shortcomings of the juvenile system and the criminal justice system, but we also see that the new administration is making changes that may bring better outcomes. We should consider supporting these initiatives and carefully measure the outcomes. We have complained that changes are needed to improve public safety, including through thoughtfully investing in community resources that will provide services and supports that can break negative cycles and help make sure young people don't end up in courts and jails and placements and prisons in the first place. The promising changes being instituted through DJS involve cooperation with community entities and stakeholders from other agencies. This is a necessary sea change that we should think about supporting. During the past few years, we've made strides in reducing unnecessary incarceration of youth. But Black and Hispanic Latinx young people still form the majority of incarcerated young Marylanders. The severing of home, family, and community ties has substantial negative effects on these young men and young women. Imprisonment does not address the challenges faced by these youth. Many youth and their families already suffer from financially vulnerable situations and a paucity of appropriate education resources and career opportunities. These negative conditions are actually exacerbated through incarceration, which also harms their spirit and stymies their progress and their growth. In place of incarceration, children and young people should be able to access local programming through DJS and through other youth-serving entities and agencies. We should also support a move away from remotely located, congregate, facility-based housing of young people. We need to bolster the utilization of local community resources, both non-residential and residential, to help ensure that specialized, individualized support is available for young people and families in contact with the Maryland legal system. We also need to support DJS, or we should at least consider supporting DJS, as departmental leadership is carefully considering alternatives to our current unsuccessful approach. As the department begins to shift towards community-based resources to help young people succeed, we should understand that DJS alone cannot comprehensively address structural conditions that contributed to concentrated violence in certain areas. DJS alone cannot address the trauma that young people living in affected communities experience as a result of their exposure to violence. Support from government leaders and collaboration among individual stakeholders and community-based organizations focused on ensuring the provision of mental health, education, and employment within under-resourced neighborhoods is going to be vital in the effort to tackle and address the complex root causes of violent and other crimes. In recognition of the need for such partnerships, the Department of Juvenile Services, in their recently released report, which I know that you folks are familiar with, as am I, committed to working in partnership with the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services and the Department of Human Services to collaboratively invest in neighborhoods throughout Maryland where DJS clients live, to not only improve their individual chances of success, but to provide increased opportunities for their neighborhoods as a whole to thrive. This represents a significant shift by the department and by the state towards investing in community-based resources in crime prevention, rather than sending young people in conflict with the law to be incarcerated far from their homes and communities. The current and historic approach of our state, which has not worked to reduce recidivism and has not increased public safety. DJS acknowledges that there are issues with their services and their residential programs, but they are working on these issues, and we should consider supporting them as they institute changes so resources are available in communities and close to the homes of young people in contact with the justice system. In his recent briefing on juvenile justice-related issues before this committee, DJS Secretary Vinnie Schiraldi noted the continuum of residential options and community options has atrophied over time, and said that in his opinion, we overuse residential treatment facilities. We overuse our DJS residential facilities, and we overuse group homes. He noted the absence of residential drug treatment programs for young people, and that there is a need to widen and deepen community-based resources. As he said, so that when judges are making dispositional decisions and prosecutors are advocating for them, they'll have a bigger menu. If this happens, he believes it will reduce recidivism and also make the system work better. The secretary said the department is working to address gaps in availability of resources around the state and is providing some services through contracts and grants, but he cautioned that a continuum of care that has been decimated over years will not be rebuilt with the press of a button. As noted in that DJS report from September, youth of color are overrepresented in the juvenile justice system as incarcerated youth, but also as victims of crime. At the same time, youth of color are underrepresented when it comes to community-based rehabilitation options such as diversion or probation. The report highlighted the serious and tragic impact that gun violence has on children of color in their communities. To help address this public health crisis in Maryland, DJS is launching comprehensive new initiatives for the young people most in danger of being involved as victims or perpetrators of gun violence. The department's new approach is rooted in national research and practice showing when interventions are targeted towards the highest risk youth to address the trauma youth experience from either witnessing or being victimized by violence, build on the young people's strengths in a developmentally appropriate way, and divert the lower risk and younger youth, these interventions yield better outcomes both for the youth and for public safety. The department report includes details about these new initiatives, and I'm just about to wrap up. The Thrive Academy will focus on wraparound services for youth who are at high risk of involvement in gun violence, and youth engagement and safety strategies improvement teams will involve prosecutors, law enforcement, community leaders, victims, and family members to advise on the best approaches to preventing gun involvement by DJS-involved youth in their communities. The department's reorientations and initiatives are at liftoff stage. We should consider supporting them and then carefully measure the outcomes because we need real long-term solutions to reduce crime and recidivism. If we strengthen families and communities in Maryland, we will enhance public safety in our state. Thank you for allowing me to present.
Thank you. We'll take questions for Mr. Maroney now, starting with Delegate Kaufman. Then we're going to go to the Vice Chair and Delegate Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Maroney, my question is, in your opinion, rather, how well does DJS do in honoring a student and ensuring that it is being met? A student's 504 plan under the Rehabilitation Act or an IEP under IDEA, because as Delegate Pastor knows, one of my areas of expertise is special education, and what we constantly fret about is the school to prison pipeline. So what do you think about how well DJS is meeting the needs of students with disabilities, and what percentage of the people in DJS custody or the people that you meet with on your monitoring visits had an IEP, IEP or 504 plan prior to getting into trouble?
Thank you so much for the question, Delegate Kaufman. I don't have figures in front of me, but I can tell you, just starting with the last question, that the figures that I've seen throughout the years are much higher than the general occurrence of 504s and IEPs in the community schools. And I also
say that again. I didn't understand. Say it one more time.
The figures that I'm familiar with and have seen throughout the years strongly indicate that there are more kids who have IEPs proportionally in DJS classes in custody than there are in similarly situated classrooms in local communities. There's a high incidence of folks who have IEPs and who have 504 plans, and also because we perform unannounced visits all the time and we sit in on classes, fly on the wall style, not interfering. We also see what may be indicative of a lot of undiagnosed issues. And so we and the folks in DJS in the education realm, which is called the Juvenile Services Education Program, try to address that as well. The bigger question, it's a work in progress, and I'm not trying to slide away from your question in regard to the quality of education inside DJS facilities, but various iterations have been tried. Way back in the day, it was a DJS responsibility. About 15 or 20 years ago, that responsibility was changed and given to the Maryland State Department of Education. Unfortunately, while they're an oversight body, they're not really They're not really involved usually in direct education. And so that did not work out very well, shall we say. And so within the last couple of years, there has been a move and a statute enacted to make sure of the formation of an independent school board specifically dedicated to hiring a superintendent for that system and to overseeing that system. We're still in the early days in regard to that.
My final comment is that just from my experience, I would venture to say that at least some of the individuals with IEPs are in there because they committed a crime due to impulsivity issues. But that's just my 2 cents of wisdom for my colleagues.
Isn't that so? Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Maroney, always good to see you. And
Thank you, Vice Chair.
while I said earlier, I will not do a ride along. I have been to plenty in my share of jails, detention centers, prisons, and I have actually visited with you at one of our detention centers. Quick question about, are you familiar with the Thrive Academy? Have you heard about the Thrive Academy?
I've heard of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I won't ask you any more questions then. Is there a national type JJMU? Is there any type of national organization of all the JJMUs of,
Not really.
Okay.
I would say that sort of inspector generals might be the closest,
Okay.
but there are few and far between any entities like ours. Occasionally, I guess ombudsperson offices can be. But real quick, what I'd say there is that, for me, where the rubber hits the road is how are they empowered? What does the empowering statute say? What powers do they have? Do they have any teeth? I mean, for me, real quick again, the most important thing about our unit, in my view, is that we perform unannounced visits and we end up publicly reporting. And with all due respect to the legal system and to lawyers in general, and my wife is a great lawyer, if we are solely dependent on the legal system, things grind very slowly. And it's mostly meetings about things that happen rather than if you can get in and be a fly on the wall and they're not expecting you, it's that much harder to perform a traditional dog and pony show, and you can find out what's going on. The other part of our thing is we're entitled to talk to anybody and look at any documentation. So that kind of thing is almost unique, but there was a very big systemic abuse issue that prompted or drove our formation.
Right. And I appreciate the quarterly reports. You mentioned that it's beneficial for children to be detained closer to their homes, right? Overall picture. I mean, that's not a direct quote,
No.
but
Yeah.
you went along those lines. Quick question, what is the benefit to that? And are they ever, if they were housed closer to their homes or detained closer to their homes, is there any opportunity that you have seen of children knowing other children who are housed in that facility and having any type of, if there's an ongoing, animosity or ongoing problem between those children, do you see that as a problem with housing or detaining children closer to their homes?
Great questions. So I want to just real quick distinguish between placement and detention. So placement, as we know, is the sort of, when we talk about detain or detainment, we're talking about detention centers, we're talking about holding places, we're talking about short term. We're talking in most cases about kids who have been charged or there's a complaint against the child, but they haven't been proved responsible or in the adult system guilty at that point. And then there's also a population in detention that are waiting to go to placement or waiting for a secondary court decision. I say that to say placement is the equivalent of the prison in the adult system. And the prisons in our state for adults are primarily situated in far Western Maryland. Equally, the prison equivalent for kids that are large congregate facilities that are operated by DJS are also all located in far Western Maryland, which happens to be far from the majority of kids do not obviously hail from that area, and they are placed far from their families, far from their mentors, far from positive, some would say also negative, peer pressure and peers. But the ability of their people and the people that they do love and that can maintain connections with them to visit becomes a real problem. The ability of the kids to relate culturally becomes a real problem. And what, in our view, over time, we've come to find, at least anecdotally, is that we're disconnecting rather than connecting the kids. We're not addressing the issues. And your point is well taken about if you put kids in a small, specialized place that is really trying to treat them as an individual and drill down. There was a place called the Mount Clair House that used to be in Baltimore City. It's gone. It used to take 3 or 4 kids from 3 or 4 different agencies, all the kids that were hardest to place or were getting in the most trouble or had, in terms of juvenile justice and the criminal justice system, the most complex issues. Let's say somebody who had been found responsible for both a sex offense and arson or something like that. And other places just wouldn't take that kid, let's say, or didn't have the ability to help that kid, and so wouldn't take them. So yeah, Mount Clair worked with those kids. Some of those kids had street beefs before or whatever, but they had to help them individually to work through them. And that became a safe space. And that was, incidentally, that was probably the most successful facility, if you want to call it that. It was more home-like, but it had a lot of very specialized help in there. And a small group of kids, totaled about 12 kids, very complex issues. Ultimately, they were closed down when there was a sweep of group home closures that was initiated by a prior DJS secretary together with a prior secretary from another department. And so in my personal view, what that did was it just took a scythe and went through the group homes, some of whom were not functioning well, some of whom weren't offering much, some of whom were amazing, but just went through them all and sort of like knocked them out of they were gone. And so I'm sorry to be long-winded about it, but I just wanted to give you that example.
Delegate Simmons, then Brammer, then Boucher.
Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you, sir.
Can you give me an idea of how many youth detention centers are in the state of Maryland?
So run by DJS, Delegate Simmons?
Correct.
Yeah, run by DJS, secure. They're all secure. They're all high security. There's a few small ones and a few large ones. There's a small one in Salisbury called Lower Eastern Shore Children's Center. It's small, maximum security. It's about 24 kids maximum. Similarly, in Western Maryland, in Hagerstown, there's a 24 bed. Also run by DJS. Then you've got the Hickey School, which is right now the capacity is in this. I'm not saying the pop, but the capacity is in the 70s, I think, in the Hickey School in Parkville in Baltimore County. Then you've got Baltimore City in the basement of the complex, so the Justice Center, the one-stop shop where the courts and everything are, and there's a high security area in the bottom. And that detention center has a capacity of 120 or so kids. Then there's, where am I? Oh, Cheltenham, of course. So Cheltenham, the old Cheltenham and the old boys village is gone, razed to the ground. I think that's a good thing. The current Cheltenham is still a very prison-like facility, but it's more state-of-the-art. It has a 72 kid capacity. It's probably about 3/4 full at the moment.
Okay, due to the high number of youth that are detained or in custody of the court, do y'all send kids outside of Maryland, other states, for housing purposes?
That happens, but it's pretty rare at this point. There was a point probably 15, 16 years ago when there were 70 or 80 kids out of state. It's usually a handful at this point, maybe 4 or 5 kids at a given time.
Are y'all tracking the level of crimes or offenses taking place within these facilities, dealing with juveniles?
So every incident that involves aggression is documented. In my time, most of them also are on camera. There's no cameras, obviously, around toilets, those kinds of areas, but pretty much everywhere else. That wasn't always the case. We managed to get cameras in everywhere over the last 15 years or so. In terms of everywhere, I mean every facility. So not only is there documentation, but there's camera footage from most situations that occur. So I would say, you know, I guess to drill down a bit further in your question, if somebody is, a staffer is assaulted, let's say, if that's where you're going, I mean, you know, that's reported to the Maryland State Police as well as to other authorities, and then they can choose to come and investigate that situation.
Referring to youth assaulting youth.
Youth assaulting youth is also captured in terms of data. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. What about foster care? Do we track the number of people in the foster care system that are entering our criminal justice system?
Great question, but not one that I'm afraid I'm not able to answer that one. Certainly there are a lot of kids I know that have been in foster care, but as far as data, I think that would be, I'm sure the information's,
Sure.
no, I'm not sure the information's actually, you know, maybe the foster care system.
Sure. Now I know we deal in throughout United States, we have drug courts and things like that. What is your thoughts on juvenile courts, specifically to deal with juvenile crimes and family support of those juveniles?
Well, we have the juvenile courts. Do you mean special courts, specialist courts,
Correct.
like mental health or
Absolutely.
drug courts?
Yeah.
You know, this is just anecdotal. You know, I've seen some specialist courts that I've seen a lot of different practices and a lot of different individuals instituting those kinds of specialist courts in very different ways. So, you know, it's very hard for me to draw a broad conclusion and say that would be good or that wouldn't be good.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Chair, thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
I was on the, several years ago, we passed a bill that allowed for a juvenile fatality review committee. I just want to go through this so the public and the committee understands. So what this committee did, the public, frankly, nobody can see a juvenile's record, criminal or otherwise. And what this committee did is it reviewed the records of juveniles who had either died or were involved in the death of another, who were within the purview of the juvenile system. And as members of this committee, subcommittee, whatever you want to call it, we got to look at all the details of this juvenile's history. And it was like a story, and frequently from the time of birth to the time of death or the time of engagement in whatever situation. Familial history, school, relationships, where they live, mental health, involvement in the education system, criminal backgrounds. And although we're not necessarily talking about juveniles who have died or juveniles who have killed another person here today, it was almost always a very relevant and similar symptom in these cases that is very reflective of some of the problems, the outstanding problems that we're talking about here today. When at the end of these cases, when we'd hear the totality of the story, it was most frequent that we would hear an escalating course of conduct. And we could kind of pick through the person's history, and then when they started to get involved in criminal activity, and you could kind of see it escalate. And oftentimes it was petty crimes, then it was like an assault, then it was like a theft or burglary, then it was like a violent crime, and eventually that youth ended up dead or involved in some other situation. We'd have these discussions, and I would point this out. And just to be clear, this wasn't just members of the juvenile justice system, it was law enforcement, people from education, people who had dealt with this background, in addition to a handful of lawmakers. And I bring this, you know, the word is escalation, this escalating course of conduct up at the end of every one of these stories. And oftentimes it was silence. Sometimes we came up with recommendations, but it was literally the same story, different details, but an escalating course of conduct for all of these youth. And what I saw on that subcommittee is very similar to what we're seeing in a lot of these cases. Now, what you'll never hear from anyone who works at a state agency is, we failed to do X, you know, and I'm not being facetious, you're never going to hear the Department of Juvenile Services say we failed on this. We failed to provide this service. And that in these reports, you always heard that every service was given. We did everything we could. And yet this particular youth died. That was frequently the case. For me, the outcome, the death, the involvement in the death of another is kind of inconsequential if you're going down this road of escalating courses of conduct. So my question is this: there's clearly some kind of hole where an average person, if they were given the purview inside the system and they could say, whoa, this youth is kind of going off the rails, you need to do something, but the Department of Juvenile Services is not catching it. In your opinion, what can we look at there for these repeat offenders for the youth that enter the system or out the same day or into the system out next week? We hear the names all the time. What can we do to really hone in on these repeat offenders and escalating courses of conduct?
Well, it's a great question. I don't have any simple solutions to that, but I can say that if my kid had some issues and they were escalating, I would pull out all the stops to try and find out, first of all, what's going on. And this is assuming that it's not something directly related to, let's say I'm abusive or something like that. I'm not talking about that kind of issue. I'm just saying a situation occurs that I can't readily explain. Why was my kid involved in that? And then there's something else, and then something else. So, I think we're going to do everything we possibly can to get to the root of that. And if we have the means, we're probably going to break ourselves financially and mentally trying to figure out how can we help the kid, etc. I think an awful lot of kids don't have that kind of individual, any individual, or behind them. If they do have an individual and there's some, amazing people that try to help kids that, in their families or extended families, but oftentimes they're limited as to what they can do. And I think that, I think you're right too, that DJS can't provide everything. There's this, what I see as a very successful, and they can kind of show it data-wise, organization in the Baltimore area that works with kids in danger of expulsion from public schools in the city, called THREAD. Those kids usually, in order to get into THREAD, their life has to be failing on various levels, not just academics. But in order to help those kids and have the success rate in working with those kids that they work with those kids for 7-8 years consistently. They'll bring them to school, make sure the kid is safely transported to school if needed. They'll make sure the kid has breakfast before going to school if that's not usually happening. They will try to help tutor. It's all volunteer. It's all volunteer stuff. But the other part of it is that the volunteers who are involved commit for years. So it's not like, hey, I like to do a little mentoring. Maybe I can help somebody. I can't this week. I might do it next week. It's like, no, this is a long-term commitment to this kid. This kid becomes a member of your family. In fact, THREAD has a situation where they're not called volunteers internally. They're called the brother, the sister, the mom, the dad, the grandpa, so that's the way it works. So what's missing, they try and fill those gaps. Unfortunately, even as they're scaling up, they can't cover everything. And I think that's what it takes. This is a very long way, and I'm a very long-winded person to try to answer your question, but you have to live in the shoes of the family and the kid and figure out what's going on, figure out what the problems are, but there's a huge service gap. And nobody needs to take responsibility if you're working for a large organization. And maybe you can't take the responsibility because you have a large caseload. So I don't think DJS is perfect. But I don't think we should go back and revisit all the things that we know for sure have already failed. So I think you good folks are listening and to all the different viewpoints and all the different problems, and are stuck with the hard task of figuring out, okay, to some degree, the problem is simple. Too many issues, too many things going on. How do we address it? Well, it's going to be complex and it's going to be long. And even if DJS succeeds far more than they ever have in the past, it's still going to be long and it's still going to have to be measured. And I don't think we're going to see change tomorrow, but we got to start somewhere, and we can't just keep doing the same thing over and over and then reverting back. You know, I think that's
a lot of what you said here. The problem remains, though. And I think everybody on this committee wants to accomplish the same thing, but we can't see anything. Therein lies the problem. Like, none of us can see one single fact about what happens about one youth in the Department of Juvenile Services. And there's no like red flag. Like, even if Department of Juvenile Services gets a red flag, and I have real problems with like the tools. They have seemed to me to not be effective in indicating to the agency that this youth is going sideways. And again, these are some examples of kids that are dead now. But I believe, you know, the failings that we've given those youth, a lot of youth are seeing the same thing. Like, I think the people we're all thinking about here today are victims of the same our failure to divert them. And I feel, you know, these different programs, like if you came to me and said, we just don't have enough services, you know, we're not filling the gaps, but that's not what I've heard. I've heard for several years, you know, and they've documented it, you know, 20-page reports, all the programs were given that we could possibly give in. So I respect what you said. I agree with a lot of what you said, but to me, taking what I've seen and thinking about how it impacts my community, I just, from the examples that people give me into the community, and they could tell me names and where these youth live, and they're back again. I think we're failing when a youth continues to escalate their conduct. And I don't have a question for you, but I hope moving forward that we could really drive in on that. Isn't that so?
You're killing me. Got all these other people. All right. Delegate Boucher for what might be the last question for this part of the panel. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chairman. Sometimes we feel like freshmen coming back again. Mr. Maroney, you gave a tremendous introductory statement. I very much appreciate your commitment to this issue and presenting your position here today. And for the record, the Hickey School holds 73 exactly. And as of last month, when I toured it, it was at 69. Is there an employment staffing issue with the juvenile detention facilities in Western Maryland? And would relocating more facilities in this metropolitan region help address that staffing issue? Is that part of the motive?
It's definitely a component. I mean, and it's not just DJS. This is like a problem across the board right now in terms of getting folks, qualified folks, and more than one application, or, you know, for anything. But it's difficult to attract psychologists, school counselors, you name it, across the board, to drive to places that are a little bit remote and then work inside a fence and behind locked doors, if they can have what they might regard as a different quality of life and a higher pay somewhere else, much closer to where they live. I think that's also a problem for other systems as well. I'm sure the prison system and other systems too. Although I will real quick say, DJS workers in general are not paid in an equitable fashion in regard to, if you compare the prison system and the DJS system. And I've never quite understood that.
So on top of the challenges all of us as employers have in the private sector, I think the challenges your department has is even much greater faced with these facilities and the inmates in them.
So I'll have to distance myself a bit from DJS because we oversee DJS and we're based in the Attorney General's office. So I see the problems, and I think the legislature throughout the years that I've been familiar with the legislature on these issues has wanted DJS to regionalize. Ultimately, what has happened over the years is that the detention or short-term kind of jail component has to some degree regionalized. There's a catchment area for Shelton that encompasses a number of counties, but let's say BCJJC in Baltimore is pretty much all kids from Baltimore in there. And there are other places where, there are regional area detention centers for kids. So kids are not being sent too far away. But then when they go to placement or the prison equivalent, which is a much longer stay, typically, they are very far away. So I think, it would be easier to help the kids to get what they need and to make changes if that's what's needed too, if they were closer to their own communities. Some people might argue it's best to pull the kids out of their communities so that they get away for a while and they can, do this, that, or the other thing and think about stuff. And but what we've seen is that, there's really you're bringing the kids to a place that is strange to them in a whole area that they're not familiar with and away from their families. As I mentioned earlier, it makes it very difficult. I mean, if you're in Baltimore and you're going to somehow try to get to see a kid in Victor Cullen Center in Western Maryland, which is the only hardware secure or maximum security facility for kids in Maryland, and it's run by DJS, and there are both girls and boys, young men and young women there. You're talking about a multi-hour journey each way, which you may or may not be able to do given your transportation issues or lack of issues, or your job issues or lack of issues. So it's not a recipe that helps people working with the kids. It's not a recipe that helps the kids towards success.
You mentioned Victor Cullen. A couple of weeks ago, Delegate Valentine and I toured Victor Cullen, and we were informed that there is a need for a 7-to-1 staff to detainee ratio. Is that standard throughout the system, or is it just because that facility has maybe some of the most violent offenders, whatever it is? I don't know.
So DJS, over the years, we've been pushing them towards lower and lower ratios in order to try to form personal relationships in a constructive way, to work with the kids in a more mentoring fashion. What they ultimately ended up doing was looking at best practices, which was a good thing. And they are on the sort of minimum end of the best practices in terms of working with kids in those kind of facilities. So it's a minimum staffing ratio of 7-to-1. It looks okay on a national basis. When you look at other systems, it's one of the better ones in terms of the ratio, but it's not got anything to do with any perceived danger or otherwise.
Yeah. But we're producing good results with the 7-to-1 ratio.
I don't think I would say that. I think there's a lot more that goes into it. I think that's better than having a 12-to-1 ratio for sure. Yes, but
reduce the recidivism rate, because ultimately that's what our objective is when these juveniles come out, to ensure that they don't go back.
So the more personal attention, the more you can try and figure out who the kid is, what the issues are, the better chance you will have if you're willing to try and help the kid and the kid's willing to go along, better chance you have of helping the kids. So I will say that. But even with that ratio in Victor Cullen, the kids are not getting an awful lot of personal attention. There's a lot of procedures and protocols and practices and locking doors and doing this and doing that. And you've got to be here at this time and there at that time. And so it's not so much relational as it is security and safety, keeping the kids safe, keeping the staff safe. And as I said earlier, it's very, very difficult to attract and retain therapists who are going to work with the kids over a long period and gain the experience that's needed. So, yeah.
we don't have high of a labor to detainee ratio, I'd like to see good results out of it. So if there's any data that correlates the ratio to the detainee, that'll be helpful.
Yeah.
Because we're investing a lot per child.
Yeah. Yeah, you are. If you go to the back of the DJS fiscal year reports that they do, which is a pretty thick volume of a few hundred pages, their DRG, data resource guides, come out each fiscal year. Go to pretty much the back page, you know, a few hundred pages in, and you will see, you'll be able to figure out from the data in there how much it would cost if a child stayed in Victor Cullen for a full year. Usually they're there 4 months, 8 months, whatever. But if you know, per diem, per day, per child, if a child was there for a year, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you look at the place I was talking about earlier, Mount Clair House, and how much that was costing, it's infinitely less. And it's, in my mind, infinitely better in the results.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Delegate Conaway, then Delegate Valentine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for coming in to testify.
Thank you.
My question is in reference to some information from the National Library of Medicine website, which I came across when I was studying on Hippocrates. I was wondering, could you comment on the effects of culture on the balance between mathematics achievement and subjective well-being? To put it another way, does DGS test the educational level of the people that they intake?
Yes, they do. And they get, there's new standards where they will get the school records of kids within a couple of days. So they'll have various sort of measurements of where the kid is. But I think your question is a little more complicated than I think I'm understanding.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you very much for your comment.
Thank you.
Valentine?
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. And thank you, sir, for coming in. And I
Thank you.
believe you've already touched on a couple of the questions I was going to ask with Victor Cullen, but I just wanted to clarify, at this point in time, the only hardware secure facility for adjudicated youth in the state of Maryland is Victor Cullen. Is that correct?
No, so let me clarify that. The only maximum or hardware secure facility for kids in the very deepest end of the juvenile justice system operated by DJS in Maryland is the Victor Cullen Center. However, there are a couple of what are called staff secure, which would be medium level security, not so much fences and locks as just staffed up. And those centers are, you know, collectively called the youth centers. There's Backbone Mountain in Western Maryland and Green Ridge in Western Maryland.
So with it only being the, for lack of a better term, more of a maximum security facility, or more of a hardware secure facility for more violent offenders, is that accurate? Or long-term offenders?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Or adjudicated.
Yeah, so Cullen is the only one of those. And it's not necessarily the sort of quote unquote worst offenders. It's if you keep cycling through the system and you fail out in other facilities, you may also end up.
You may end up at Victor Cullen. And it's my understanding that that houses a maximum of 24 youths. Is that correct?
At this point, yeah, it's around, it's in the 20s.
It's in the 20s because it was reduced from the mid 40s down to 24.
Yes. Correct. Partially on need of there was a declining need. Yeah.
But when I toured Victor Cullen, they had said that there was a substantial waiting list for use to come to Victor Cullen. So there would be a need. Would that be correct?
Well, at any given time, there can be waiting lists. There's still COVID going on, and you know they'll close a facility for new entrants for a while. So that could be one of the reasons that you heard that. To my knowledge, there's not a limit. There's not a problem with the limitation of space in terms of Cullen, Backbone, Green Ridge. There's not a problem of limitation of space, and even in a worst case scenario, they could bump up their rated capacity. They could. The physical plant is still pretty much the same as it ever was. So if need arose, and hopefully it never will, they could bump that a little if they needed to.
Now, could the other facility that was mentioned, that I'm not sure if you mentioned today, was the Garrett Children's Center. Is that another facility that could kind of mirror Victor Cullen, but it currently isn't? Am I correct in that? If you're not familiar.
You could reopen Garrett. Right now, Garrett is being used by DJS and the Juvenile Services Education component of DJS to house teachers who are transmitting out lessons virtually to fill teacher vacancy and lack of subject matter expert gaps in all the facilities. So it's being used.
It's being used. There's just
but it's not being used to house kids right
there's
now.
no youth there.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah. It's also a very remote location.
I'm familiar with the center, the location. The Victor Cullen it was explained to me they currently had about a 17 youth waiting list was what was just the concern that I had and what I wanted to ask the question for.
Right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, sir, for that really great explanation. I know we've talked about a lot of issues with the system and where we're failing children, and I'm just really curious, based on everything you've seen, could you give us an idea of sort of best practices and services that you see that we're doing, or you've seen in other jurisdictions that we could adopt that would lead to the best outcomes for our youth? Like if you had to boil it down for us.
Wow, that's a great question. So number one, keep the kids out by having a community, strengthening local communities, finding out which neighborhoods are the most blighted, have the least resources, the most impoverished, and work long-term to try and do something, invest in those areas, concentrate on those areas, don't ignore those areas or discriminate against those areas. And that's where you'll get the best bang for your buck. In terms of once the kids are already in the system and are being sent out of home, to some degree, we've already failed. But in terms of what can be done at that point, smaller groups, smaller places closer to home, so that with all of the folks that are harder to attract to come to Cullen and other places may very well be willing to go to a local place and work and maybe they're a specialist, maybe they're working in various places and they specialize in a certain kind of condition that a kid might be evidencing. Maybe they would be interested in coming to work or helping some kids who needed that kind of help. But it's very difficult to attract those folks to large congregate facilities to work with the kids. So places that are doing that, there's some places that are doing that. New York has a closer to home program, which has sort of converted a lot of the more remotely located places into specialized places closer to home. Washington State has some different model for kids where they are heavily sort of social worker orientated in their approach rather than and I'm not saying this about DJS or Maryland workers, but they're the opposite end of the spectrum to the sort of junior prison guard type thing you've got. And again, I'm not saying that's what DJS are, but there are probably places in the country where that's the case. But if you get more towards trying to figure out what the problem is and addressing it and using people who may be able to do that and maybe able to relate to the kids a little bit, and you can work in small numbers, and that's where you're going to get the best bang for your buck. But the reason a lot of the kids, as I said earlier, get into these situations, are not the reason, but part of the driver is they don't have resources, they don't have advocates, they don't have money in their background. And so to try and replicate that as much as possible, as possible, early intervention is really the key.
That's super helpful. And my one follow-up would be, do you have any familiarity with the Anne Arundel County Fresh Start program?
I have heard of it.
Know any of the
I
details?
don't know the details.
I'd be so
No.
curious of
Sorry
your
about
opinion of
that.
it. So maybe in the future we can discuss that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, seeing no more questions for Mr. Maroney, we're going to move on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We have our last panel of the day. We'll hear from Ms. Sickman, Mr. Ford, Mr. Bayless, if you'd come to the table. Do we have one that's virtual, Ms. Sickman? Okay, that's fine. We're going to give you 12 minutes to start. Who would like to begin? Just so all right, Mr. Ford's going to begin. And we're going to try and wrap up the openings by about 5:06, give or take. So go ahead, Mr. Ford.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Ford, Executive Director of the Shriver Center at UMBC, and we have been providing mentoring and advocacy for systems-involved youth for more than 35 years. The former members of the Juvenile Justice Reform Council are deeply concerned about youth crime and its impact on victims throughout the state. Public safety was a primary focus of our work spanning 2.5 years. Our goal was to address issues from a systemic and policy level and to align Maryland with national trends. Ultimately, what we learned with this was a human rights issue. While serving as a member of the Juvenile Justice Reform Council, I also served as chair of the State Advisory Group, which is a part of Maryland's Office of Crime Prevention and Youth and Victim Services. The goal of the SAG, as it's called, is to ensure the state is in compliance with the Federal Juvenile Justice Delinquency Act of 1974. The JJRC did that through our recommendations. During the 2019 session of the Maryland General Assembly, the legislature passed and Governor Hogan signed a bill, Senate Bill 856 and House Bill 606, establishing the Juvenile Justice Reform Council, which was to be staffed by the Department of Legislative Services. The JJRC recommendations were intended to advance public safety and reduce recidivism. The JJRC was charged with 1, using data-driven approach to develop a statewide framework of policies to invest in strategies to increase public safety and reduce recidivism amongst youth offenders. 2, research best practices for the treatment of juveniles who were subject to the criminal and youth legal systems. 3, identify and make recommendations to limit or otherwise mitigate risk factors that contribute to youth contact with the legal system. 4, the JJRC was directed to convene an advisory stakeholder group that includes representatives from organizations with experience in youth legal policy reform, advocating for groups with disproportionate contact with the legal system, and advocating for victims of crime and with restorative justice. 5, the JJRC was required to utilize a technical assistance provider to help carry out the mission of the council. The council submitted an interim report on its findings and recommendations to the governor and the General Assembly in a final report. The charge of the JJRC was not to reduce incarceration and detention, create a more lenient juvenile justice system, advance principles of youth positive development or restorative justice, or focus on making the system more equitable due to Maryland's high level of racial disparities. We would like to point out that the JJRC included mostly agency heads from the Hogan administration and legislators on both parties. This body was made up of people who were clear-eyed about our purpose, to be more effective and focus on public safety and recidivism. We were intentional about including feedback from community members. 16 listening sessions were held throughout the state and attended by approximately 530 people. Regional, local management boards who receive state and federal funds to distribute to service providers for youth programming were also present. JJRC members attended these sessions, and overwhelmingly we heard that more resources were needed to divert youth from the legal system. We did not hear a call for an increase in detention or need for longer involvement in the legal system. The Vera Institute was chosen as our technical assistance provider. From federal, state, and local advocacy to expert data analysis and research, Vera develops solutions to help understand and explain legal systems and their impacts. Vera surveyed the council members to ask about their priorities. For each issue, Vera would present data on Maryland as well as offer a national picture. We would then discuss and draft a policy recommendation. The recommendations made by the JJRC are not prohibiting state and local agencies' ability to address youth crime. I stated by expressing empathy for the victims of crime throughout the state. But I also ask you to view youth who are involved in the legal system as victims of trauma, abuse, violence, neglect, and under-resourced communities. When youth in the Choice Program, which is a mentoring advocacy program that I oversee, were asked about resources they needed, they responded with programs like Youth Works all year round, driver's education programs, and funding for college. So I'd encourage us to ask youth themselves what supports work best for them. So I'll pass it on to Nate, a former colleague of the JJRC, and he will go a little deeper into the recommendations.
Thank you, Eric, and thanks to the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. My name is Nate Bayless. I work at the Annie Casey Foundation in Baltimore. I'm the director of our Juvenile Justice Strategy Group, where we work to advance juvenile justice reforms around the country. So it was a real honor to serve on the JJRC in my home state where I've lived almost my entire life. I'm going to offer more background on the JJRC, which I hope will underscore why it was the right thing to do when the legislature overwhelmingly approved these measures. This was a good decision. It's why there was such broad consensus for each of the JJRC's recommendations. Despite concerning increases in some categories of juvenile crime right now, the Juvenile Justice Reform Act remains a good decision, and I hope to have time to discuss that in terms of questions that we would get from all of you. But starting where Eric left off, for each topic, the Bureau of Institute of Justice would typically provide two presentations, right? One focusing on national trends and best practices in states around the country, and one focusing on Maryland data and the Maryland system. And based on what we learned, the council would draft policy recommendations, and then we discuss them, we debate them. And it was very clear that the chairs of the council were seeking consensus, if not a unanimous position. If there wasn't close to consensus, we'd wait till the next hearing and then we'd work on it till we got to consensus. Why? Because we understood that this council didn't just exist as a council. Its purpose was to affect policy. And if we didn't have consensus on the council, then there was unlikely that it was going to influence legislation, which was obviously the goal. So what were the recommendations? I know you know these, but I just want to go through them pretty quickly because I think there are 5 big things, and some of these are getting more attention now than others. One was setting a minimum age, 13 for most offenses. Maryland didn't have any minimum age. So little kids were getting arrested every year, and 10 for crimes of violence. Expanding diversion authority. The final law ended up being different than the JJRC recommendations, but the idea, based on research that I'll talk about, was because diversion, keeping kids out of the juvenile justice system more often than not results in much better outcomes for public safety than when you don't. No misdemeanors or violations of probation in detention other than gun-related crimes or when young people have 2 or more adjudications in a year, and no misdemeanors or violations of probation to commit youth, again, other than firearm offenses. And finally, changes to probation lengths of stay, where young people were staying irrespective of offense on probation for months and years. Now, while each of the JJRC's recommendations was distinct, and I'd love to get into the specifics with all of you, I think there's a common thread across all of them, and it's 2 things. First, that each of the recommendations seeks to improve public safety, as was our charge, and reduce recidivism rates for the population of youth impacted by the rule, whatever that thing was, whether it was on the minimum age, whether it was on diversion and so forth. Secondly, each of the recommendations also tries to narrow the focus of the juvenile justice system to focus on young people most in need of services, supports, and supervision, those highest risk for future violence, for future serious offending. It seeks to keep the system and the Department of Juvenile Services eye on the ball. Every one of these things. So for example, I'm only going to talk about one of them, but there was a plethora of research showing that diverting young people from formal system involvement gets better recidivism and public safety outcomes than when kids are prosecuted. When youth are diverted, they're connected to services right away, rather than after a sometimes lengthy court process. And it goes beyond just these short-term public safety outcomes. A prominent research study from just a couple of years ago, looking at kids in, I think it was Philadelphia, Baton Rouge, and Orange County, California, found that youth who were prosecuted rather than diverted had a greater affiliation with delinquent peers, lower school enrollment, less ability to suppress aggression, lower perceptions of opportunities, and lower odds of graduating high school. Diverting youth, though, my second point from before, also keeps lower risk youth and youth with more minor offenses off of probation caseloads. The JJRC was presented with data showing that the probation population was mostly young people with misdemeanors. Thousands of youth were referred for minor offenses that demand an immediate response, demand accountability, but not the intensive services and time that we want DJS to spend on youth who concern all of us. The young people who we are hearing about today, young people carrying and using guns, young people who are committing acts of violence. This is the thrust of where DJS's efforts seem to be going right now. And we talked a little bit before about the Thrive Academy. I heard that come up before. Like, this is the very point of that, to throw the best we have at young people who really need it. We could say the same about the minimum age, but we'll talk about that hopefully more. But there's a lot more to say about all this, but I just, we're short on time, and it seems important to use some of this time to talk about why we're here. I think it's somewhat shocking, to all of us as we met to talk about this today, that we're back here 1 year after this really, really important legislation. We understand people's concerns about crime. We have those concerns too. We're Maryland residents. Nobody should live in fear for their safety, least of all the young people who too often don't feel safe through no fault of their own. And they're going through a lot right now. We just need to ask them. And I hope that we will ask them this session in this room. I hope we'll ask those young people. I think our responses and concerns to crime have to be rooted in reality. It can be true that crime and youth crime is a problem and that the new law is working, that kids being diverted are most of the time succeeding, that kids under 13 who are accessing services through children in need of supervision are most of the time succeeding. Both of those things can happen. We also need to call out bad faith arguments when they're being made, such as the notion that 11-year-olds are criminal masterminds and driving a crime wave. And we need to be very careful about the way that we talk about our young people. It is hard not to watch the news coverage right now and wonder whether we're seeing a replay of the disastrous super predator images of the 1990s. And it's irresponsible to point to the new law as the driver of crime trends when what Maryland is experiencing is the exact same thing that are happening all around the country in places that did not pass the Juvenile Justice Reform Act last year. So what do? Yes, examine sins, examine the child in need of supervision and see how we strengthen it. Yes, fund diversion and intervention services so that youth in Wicomico County are as likely to have robust mental health, positive development, and mentoring services as a kid in Baltimore County. Yes, we deserve that. They all deserve that. And we need to commit, everyone needs to commit in this system to implementing the law to get the public safety outcomes Marylanders deserve. From that, I will pass it to Melissa.
And I'm going to give her, I'm sorry, about 2 or 3 minutes here, and then I'm going to open it up for questions.
Okay, I'll try to go through as the day was progressing, I was deleting things. So my name is Melissa Sickman. I was appointed to the JJRC by Governor Hogan as the national expert. I was at the time director of the National Center for Juvenile Justice, which is the Pittsburgh-based research division of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, where I had worked since 1986. I'm retired now, hence in my house here. Prior to 1986, though, I was a Maryland resident for 10 years, so I was happy and pleased to come back and about Maryland juvenile justice. The National Center for Juvenile Justice has been involved in various projects related to state juvenile justice reform, supporting policymakers' use of data to inform their decision-making. The center monitors trends in key juvenile justice legislation, and I have also served on various committees of Pennsylvania's state advisory group, including its diversion subcommittee. So juvenile policies, as we've been talking today, or you all have been talking today, require balancing the interests of public safety, accountability to victims and community for the harm caused by youth, and youth rehabilitation. The challenge for state lawmakers is to develop policies that seek to disrupt those pathways that bring youth into the justice system, and to do that without wasting taxpayer dollars. The best way to do that is to develop evidence-based based policies informed by research and data. The recommendations in the JJRC reports reflect a research and data informed decision-making process. So what does the research tell us? I won't go over all the things that Eric and Nate already spoke about and prior speakers, but the research has shown that juvenile justice policies should avoid the unnecessary involvement of youth in the juvenile justice system because the system can cause harm. To put a kid in to get some treatment, and that's the reason it scares me. It means that policies should strive to keep most youth in the community and not to involve them in the system any longer than is absolutely necessary. The impact on reoffending diminishes after about 6 months of treatment or supervision. Just some other information, recent work by NCJJ, recent research has reaffirmed that most youth do not become involved in the juvenile justice system. Only about 12% of the youth population were referred to juvenile court in this study. And most youth who were referred to juvenile court did not have serious charges, and most did not return. 63% of the youth who came to juvenile court once did not return. So most youth who come to the attention of the justice system are engaging in normal adolescent behavior and should be diverted from the system. But there were a small share of kids, 14% of the youth, who had 4 or more referrals and accounted for about 45% of all the cases that were handled by their involved kids from the very first time they showed up to court until they aged out. Those are the kids that need the attention. It's very expensive and wasteful to create a juvenile justice system that handles most kids as though they were the rare repeat violent youth. The JJRC recommendations were aimed at creating a system most appropriate for most youth and carved out exceptions for the youth with the most serious charges. Over the past several years, many states have made sweeping changes to their juvenile justice systems. For most, the process was very similar to Maryland's JJRC process. And in both red states and blue states, the resulting reforms have been similar. Shrink the system and do what works to reduce reoffending. When states make substantial policy changes, as the prior speaker noted, there needs to be data collection to monitor the intended and unintended impacts of the changes. We need to know what are the impacts on community safety and what are the impacts on youth accountability to victims, on youth outcomes, and on fairness, even though those weren't necessarily all the charges to the committee. Government systems must also be held accountable, just like the kids, to make the improvements that they are needed in these areas. If the data show that change has not led to the improvements that were intended, then more change is needed. I'm just not sure that Maryland has enough data in hand yet to determine the impacts of the legislation that was passed. I'm done.
Okay, we're going to take questions now for this panel. We'll go to Delegate Pasteur to begin.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank each of you. Diversion services and diverting and diversion. So what comes under that, and where does education fit into that? And I'm speaking about skills development, because even though one is detained, they still should get those services or the education to handle wherever they are, as Ms. Delegate Kaufman asked earlier, particularly those students who have special education needs. So what kinds of things are included there? Because all of the things that are being done, once they leave, one day we would like for them to be you, to be me, etc. So how do we sustain all of those social and educational needs that they really need, and in some cases why they're there?
So just so to be clear, because you started off, I think, asking about diversion services, but then I wasn't sure if you're asking about kids when they're in custody, or are you talking about kids who never end up in custody? Or
No, I'm talking about those who are in what I call the second system, which is this, who are being detained. How do we, and also looking at how do we keep them from being in that system? Because I see it all coming together, actually.
Sure. So I'd love for others to answer, but I think obviously education is a huge part of it, and it's what we would expect for most kids. And we know that some young people coming to the juvenile justice system haven't been connected to school for some period of time. So we need to set goals and help them get there. I think there are a lot of programs that are aimed at helping young people who are at risk of failing in school or risk of falling out of school to be connected. I think within the juvenile justice system, typically kids ought to have goals. If they're on probation, for example, that would be related to school, reasonable goals that are about helping them achieve in school and doing well in school. As you said, some kids are going to have IEPs and so forth. I think on the diversion side, one of the advantages of avoiding detention, and one thing that I hope Melissa can probably speak to some of the data on, but is when young people are detained, their odds of ever going back to school, I'm talking about nationally, okay? Their odds of ever going back to school and graduating go down significantly. That locking kids up has a huge negative impact on education. And it's one of the biggest problems with it for a variety of reasons that we probably could all imagine. That one, just literally reconnecting to that school is challenging, right? And that the school that's dealing with all of its own issues, right, is going, do I want this kid back who's just been locked up in the jail and coming back into the school? So schools are not always receptive of bringing kids back. Kids are falling behind during their time because there's a lot of idle time, and we hear about that in detention centers. So I just making the point that I think avoiding detention, if our concern is about education, yes, we should do the very best for school. And I think DJS just brought in the national expert for its schools, David Domenici. However, like if our focus on education, you need to be keeping kids out.
Okay, and I agree. We want to keep them out, but you cannot dismiss that whole education piece is exceedingly important, because that's where children spend the bulk of their days.
Yes.
Whether they go or not, they might spend the bulk of their days during school time trying not to be there. So they have to find things and places to do. But whenever we have this conversation, doesn't matter which side you're on, we sort of go around what education should look like to support these young folks in terms of skill-based needs, in terms of making sure they don't go back, making sure they don't go in. So that's what I'm looking for in terms of an answer, because we can't skirt that, and if we're talking about diversion. So
I was going to jump in a little bit. Just, I think sometimes the kids are making a choice of kind of fading away from school. They're not maintaining a good connection with the school. Sometimes the schools are kind of pushing the kids out. They may be, I understand that the only SROs are really in Baltimore, but, if the kids are getting, sort of brought up on charges because of bad behavior at school that the schools might be able to handle, but it's getting referred to the justice system instead, that's problematic. There is in Pittsburgh, where I live, in Allegheny County, because that was a problem so much and disproportionately affecting Black girls, they started they're calling it a diversion program, but it's really kind of diversion and prevention, where anybody can contact through the United Way 211 system and get referred to services before it goes to the justice system. And they're getting a lot of referrals from school. So instead of the school calling police, they're contacting this to engage services for the kids, which is done in a very personal, very soft handoff kind of way. And I'm proud to be involved in some research that we'll be doing to see how effective it is. There's a lot of things that can be done to try to keep kids better connected in schools. And if kids are having, there was discussion earlier about foster kids. Foster kids are often struggling in school and may end up becoming delinquent. There was a question before about, is there information data on that happening in Maryland in terms of how much dual system youth there is? And yes, the School of Social Work in Baltimore has data on that. So yes, it's something that I think Maryland should pay attention to. How well is the state doing keeping kids engaged in school?
Thank you. And that's my bottom line, that we keep ignoring that. And we let
keep kids in school and out of court. That's the saying that our organization had.
Yeah, that's the bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Bayless, I'm a big fan of Annie Casey and some of its work. So I'm going to direct this question to you. Okay. I'm a kids count guy, so, use that data. Often in my discussion with police leadership, they suggest that the only way to get children into diversionary programs and to mandate participation is by adjudicating the children, right? Our classic style. And you've talked a lot about diversion as the preference and the answer. Given our changes, how do we address, if it's not true, then what's the perception, and why do they have this perception that we have to take our children through the process of being adjudicated?
So that's a great question. So thanks for asking that question. And I'll say that I thought Officer Boatwright earlier sort of helped speak to some of this too, which is that most young people, when they get arrested, just giving general, the kids get arrested, they're brought to the front, will never get arrested again, right? I think we heard something that said, he said, imagine the first time a kid gets arrested, how scary that would be, right? Imagine all of us, you get pulled over on the side of the road and your heart is racing just from that, I'm 47, right? And it would scare me to be in that situation. I would have to control myself, right? So imagine being 15 years old and being arrested. Your parents know you've been arrested. Your school might know you've been arrested. For most young people, when they're arrested, they're not arrested again, right? So this is what's really hard throughout these conversations, because we know also that there are kids who will be arrested and will continue with that behavior, right? We know that there are some kids, right? The kids are just different. And so what the system, though, is trying to do here through the law, as far as I could tell, and through the recommendations, was to be just reasonable about this, right? To say it's not that every young person should be diverted from the system. However, we should assess young people when they come in at intake. And if we think this is a young person who would be better off being just referred to a service in the community, to give them a shot at that, right? Without the system involvement, let's do that, because we know, again, all of this research that tells us overall, young people, when they're prosecuted, do a lot worse. So it's the tension we always have in the juvenile justice system. And I know from everyone working in that role, which is each kid's different, but we have to be giving kids opportunities to succeed outside of the system, because we want them to live their lives outside of this system. We do not want them to be part of the juvenile justice system. We don't want them to be part of the criminal justice system. So we got to give them a shot. And when it doesn't work, if the young person gets rearrested, right, they're back in front, and there's another chance to look at what's going on and seeing, do we think this, maybe we just didn't do it right the first time, or do we think that maybe we do need to go to juvenile court? So I hope that.
So you're suggesting, I'm hearing you, that we should offer the diversion, even though it may not be mandated, right? Because we can't mandate it unless they're adjudicated. Is that a correct statement that the officers are sharing with me?
No, in the sense that if a young person is diverted, and if they're diverted by Department of Juvenile Services, okay. So if you're talking about if they're diverted by law enforcement, in other words, they're just saying, we're going to take you home and just Yeah, well, right. I mean, there's no, if that's their choice, but if they arrest and the young person comes to DJS intake, then yes, it's DJS now has authority over that case. And just because they've been diverted doesn't mean they can't be brought back in front of juvenile court.
One last thing, because you mentioned time and how important it is to address these issues.
Yes.
Often if I'm incarcerated, it takes a longer period of time to address
Totally.
it. So I'm going to give you a scenario because I was very concerned about something that occurred in my community. And I apologize, Mr. Chairman. I know we want to get out of here. There was an incident where a young man was in a library, and because he had been disruptive, he was told he couldn't be in the library multiple times. Okay. On this particular occasion, the police officers are called and they detain this young man. Ultimately, they send him home, but it's a big brouhaha. We know this occurred. I want to understand what has happened to this young man. It happened to be, and his brother. Both of them were kicked out of the library, never to come back again. It was probably 30 days before we figured out that it took about that long for this family to be referred to DJS. In my mind, that's too long. So no different than going through the process. Is the system broken on how quickly we can address some of these issues?
I don't know enough to know what the normal amount of time is that happens with DJS. I'm a little shaken just by the idea that kids wanting to go to a library, and it's not my almost 13-year-old wouldn't know where our library is, and it's a half mile from my house. So I'm just throw that. But in thinking about that situation, though, I mean, the immediacy. I mean, any of us who have kids, we know this from the time that they're little, right? I mean, like you can't wait a week and say, remember the time you took the cookie and you weren't supposed to, like you're a bad boy. Like you can't do that. You need to have responses right away. And so I don't know if that's a typical time for how it is. I know that DJS has timelines under which it needs to operate, but yeah, that's way too long. Of course, it's way too long. It's way too long for a consequence for something where the community is crying out to do something.
And Nate, can I jump in here? Because I think the other thing is that there should, if there aren't now, be other ways to hold kids accountable. That we think of the justice system and we use the word accountability a lot, but really the accountability is to victims and to the community for the harm that's caused. That situation that you described could have had a circle, a meeting, a mediation of sorts between the youth, their family, their supports people, and the library to make sure everybody understands, hey, you were disruptive to the library. We have rules here, but also for the library to understand banning someone for life from this facility that is about learning, you know, those kinds of restorative justice discussions can be very, very beneficial and shouldn't take 30 days to set up.
The Vice Chair, the delegates Grammer and Boucher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both of you for serving on the JJRC and for being, all three of you, I'm sorry, for serving and for being here today. If I heard you right, you said there were 16 listening sessions, right? And so the JJRC statute was approved in 2019, it became effective in June 1, 2019. And then there are, I'm sorry, the council. I mean, everything I'm gonna ask about is the council, even if I say something else. Okay, so so were there representatives from victims organizations or victims advocacy organizations in the JJRC?
I don't remember on the JJRC. I don't think
so.
Specifically like a victims group.
Okay, so I'm looking at the JJRC myself and I see that there was an advisory stakeholder group. Is that separate and apart from the actual council, the advisory stakeholder group? Was that a separate?
That's different.
That's different. Okay. All right. That's why I was asking, because it says something about victims advocates being in that group, and I just wanted to understand how they were related. But it sounds like I'm not asking that question to you. So I'll ask the chair that later on. Okay.
But I am hearing that there were victim advocacy groups on the council.
Okay. And I believe law enforcement, Maryland State's Attorneys Association and an individual from law enforcement, were they part of the JJRC?
Yes,
Okay.
I think Baltimore
I mean,
City Police was on the council.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
You can look in the reports and it lists everybody's participation, who was there.
Right. Right. Yep. I see the roster, the 2021 roster. I'm looking at it now, but I don't know where everybody is from. So that's one of the reasons why I was asking. So are there going to be, or would you recommend any further types of meetings such as what was done with the JJRC to continue the effort? Because there was a lot going on between 2019 and 2022 when the legislation came out from the recommendations. There was a lot going on. And it seems like, you know, there has been a lot that might have come as a result of COVID, and children being confined and you know, the loss of education during that time period, et cetera, everything. So I'm seeing you nodding your head. So would there be a benefit to continuing some type of council or some type of meetings? And would you recommend that to be?
Yeah, I don't know that you need a council, but you as legislators need to be informed. And I would say that the state of Maryland, the public at large, you as legislators, and you know, anybody who has any kind of interest in what's going on with juvenile justice should be continually made aware of what the trends are, and you know, sort of what are the expectations after we made this change. Has everything been implemented the way there's nice implementation manuals and guidance on the JJRC website, which I didn't even, because I'm not in Maryland, I didn't even realize that stuff was there. Have they, I mean, they've told everybody what to do, but is it happening the way it should be happening? And then what data points would you be expecting, you know, to kind of set benchmarks? I would expect this to change this much in this way. You know, some of the things around the facility populations, et cetera, et cetera. You know, you can keep everybody informed so that you can decide, do we need other changes? Do we need different changes that we didn't even discuss before? Some of what we've talked about, you know, all of today, talking about the need for services, it's not just services, it's evidence-based services, things that are shown to work. Does Maryland have that? I think maybe we didn't talk about that enough in terms of, are the things that DJS or entities outside of DJS that they're doing and providing for kids, do they work? Because if you're spending tax dollars on a bunch of stuff that doesn't work, that feels good, but is not effective, then that's a waste of taxpayer dollars, you know. So that there might be a need to have some research. There might be a need to bring in some additional speakers, or for you as legislators to connect with people in other states that maybe are a year or two ahead of you in making these kinds of reforms. Or I would invite you to come talk to people in Pennsylvania. There was one session where we had some of the people from Pennsylvania's juvenile reform task force, but they haven't passed legislation yet. So you're ahead of them in that way, and they might want to learn from you. But some of the choices that they made, and you know, very specific things in the legislature, you know, in the statutes that are being proposed, are a little different. So you know, those kinds of conversations to keep you informed. But I really think the data and what are we doing and what works. There are some states that you can't get state dollars to fund a program unless you can show it works. Washington State does that. State's not going to pay for it. Tax dollars are not going to go for it. They can get funding elsewhere, but you know, now that sounds very harsh, and you don't want that to quash innovation, but there's ways to do that.
Delegate Grammer.
Mr. Chair. So I'm a little concerned, you guys are concerned to be back here. So my experience with juvenile crime is that for the last 9 years, it's just gotten worse, even prior to the changes which tend to take over the debate about juvenile crime recently. Prior to the bills passing, prior to the news coverage, in my district, the situation has been bad for years. You've expressed that the recent changes have not made an impact, but I would challenge that to the point where all the streets that surround the street on which I live, I now have to account to those people the problems with juvenile crime. But here's my first question. I constantly hear that a youth's involvement in the juvenile system is not actually wanted. To me, the juvenile system is a benefit, whether it's as an alternative to the adult system, whether it's a point of diversion, whether it's a point a youth can receive services, that's a positive to me. And I'm not thinking about the youth that are arrested once and they don't come back. Nobody's thinking about that at all. What we're thinking about on this committee are the youth who commit a crime, are back out on the street, and they commit another crime the same day or the next week or the next month, etc. Unequivocally, the state is failing those children. And those are the children we're thinking about. So my first question is, do you see the juvenile system as a benefit? And where are the holes that are causing these children to repeat offend, sometimes multiple times on the same day?
So a couple things. I'll jump in. One thing, just from where you started. So one of the challenges of coming and I think working in an organization that is very focused on data is that I strongly value the experiences and voices of people and how they experience crime. That's what we do every day. And we go and we talk with people and see what's going on. And so I've learned long ago that I can't put data in front of the lived experiences that people are having. And so I really appreciate where you're coming from, Delegate Grammer. And we know that nationwide across thousands of law enforcement agencies, that juvenile arrests are down significantly over the last 25 years. So I understand that I know that arrest and crime are not the same thing. First of all, like, right, we have proxies for this throughout. So I understand that. But we're talking about across the entire country in every single state, juvenile arrests have been down over decades. So I really don't mean that to say like what you're saying is wrong, but I'm just, it's a challenging place to be in because we look at that data. I also know that across the country and right here in Maryland, that one of the things that one of the few things now we can look at across and see what's happened in the last couple of years, we've been surveying the country around detention data. And I can tell you that juvenile detention around the country has gone up in the last couple of years. In fact, since before COVID, it's up 10% across the places that we've been surveying. And from the low in August 2020, it's up over 50%. Okay. So the experience of like what you're saying, like validating what you're saying, right? That the serious things that concern us and that we're seeing in our communities have been going up, especially in recent years. So I don't, the 10-year period you're talking about, it's harder for me to see it like in the data. Maryland's arrests way before this legislation were dropping a lot, and COVID threw it all into it's very hard. So none of us should be using, just so I say, 2020 and 2021 numbers are just bizarre, right? They're so different that like it's worth looking at with all of them at a grain of salt. So I think what you're describing is precisely the young people we should be deeply concerned about. And why? Any of us as parents, again, or anyone we love in our lives, we would not want them to be arrested even one time, and certainly not over and over again. Like irrespective of whether they get locked up or anything, this isn't good for their life chances. We want them to be happy and thriving and doing things we want kids to do. So yes, that should concern us, right? So it's hard for me to speak to any specific incident and going, this kid was arrested twice in the same day and nothing happened. I think what I'm sort of would be really good for people to understand, and I know someone was talking about the case processing process before, is to really understand how exactly this all works. Like, I think it is very important to understand that. And I saw some of that happening over an incident last week in Baltimore, understanding what happens when police recommend that a young person is held. What happens in the process? DJS does its screening tool. I know there was skepticism about the screening tools. Look at the screening tools. Like we should look at them and say, what do we think? Because they're in that DJS data guide. Anyone can look at them and go, is this a good process or a bad process? Talk about that. You know, I agree. But I think DJS is making decisions. Some of the things, just to be really clear, as far as I can see, when a young person, because it came up today as an example that didn't make a lot of sense to me. If a young person has a gun as part of what's happening, not by state law, but by DJS policy, those kids are held in detention. They're held in detention when that happens, right? They go to court the next day, and might be all kinds of things that come up about that case, and they might be released. So I really don't want to evade the question, because I'm with you. Like, I'm concerned about that. I don't want kids getting arrested on back-to-back days, and we should be responding to them. Those seem like the kids who need more than just throw a voluntary service at them or throw them a diversion service. Like, they need more than that. They need the follow-up. So I don't disregard that at all.
Regarding the data, because this is the disconnect here, I think I'd love to see the data as much as you'd love to see the data. With that said, juvenile crime is not down 2/3 in Maryland. If I could wait, my job as a legislator, if I could stick it in the bill and I could tell you how many calls each jurisdiction generated and how many cops showed up and how many police, I'd love to. I cannot do that.
Right.
I can't draft that bill.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight about how you could accurately account for the disconnect between actual crime and what the system sees?
A little bit, right? And so I know, actually, yeah, Melissa, why don't you jump?
I was just going to say, at the federal level, there's sort of two big measures of crime. The police data that the FBI collects from all the police department, or as many as they can around the country. And that data system has gone through some changes, but if Maryland police departments are using a incident-based reporting system, you can easily tell like the difference between a crime was reported, was there an arrest, and who was arrested. The trouble with just reports of crime, there's no age of an offender attached to it. It's only until there's an arrest in these data systems that you can tell it was a kid. The other thing is the crime victimization survey, which BJS, I believe, still will help states in conducting one at the state level, because the sampling process at the national level doesn't really get down to state level detail. But that's a process where you're contacting a sample of households and asking them, have you been the victim of a crime? What was it? And it goes on and on. There's school crime supplement to go to that obviously is focused mostly, on kids. Those two things could be done just for the state of Maryland to see.
Kelly Kramer, I also, sorry, I think one other thing, sorry to cut you off, Melissa, but I just, one other thing, just looking at the, Maryland, that's worth understanding, because I think it may speak a little bit to what you're saying. If you were to look again you can see it in the DJS data book. So even skeptical about like all their data is what's coming to intake. So that's all they can report on is what's coming to intake. But what I would say, if you look in that data, and I know you all represent completely different parts of the state, is that the odds that a kid will be arrested living in one county versus the next are wildly different around the state, right? Completely different. And when you throw in race on top of that, it's unbelievably different, like the way that works. So the Eastern Shore counties, for example, have way higher rates of arrest. Okay, I'm not going to say crime, right? Of arrest than you would see in other counties. Even in the same regions, Baltimore County has a much higher arrest rate than Baltimore City right? Like has a higher arrest rate, and then lots of kids get diverted. Whereas Baltimore City, fewer lower percentage get diverted. So I think it's a good discussion about what's the data we actually care about. Like, what's the thing we really want to know? Is it really about like arrests, or is like what are the kids who are actually getting further into the system? I would love to follow up with you on this because I think it's an important thing that you're tapping into.
That aforementioned system.
I don't actually know how, like, the DGS data guide, I think, is just what comes from the police.
The FBI crime-based input.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
SINs, child in need of supervision. So we've kind of danced around this, but we haven't really drilled down on how it works. So not every case that a law enforcement officer is petitioned to the courts via SINs. If a law enforcement officer petitions one of these cases to the courts, is the judge required to affirm that particular petition?
I'll just say I don't know enough about how it works to comment on like how the SIN system work. And honestly, it wasn't one of the things in the JJRC, we didn't go into the details of like how to change or modify SINs as part of that conversation.
I'm getting
It's different all over the country.
Yeah,
In Pennsylvania, they are by definition dependency cases. They're not delinquency cases.
My inquiry goes thus. If a law enforcement officer has a SINs petition, the court is not required to affirm that, and they shouldn't be bound to do that, but they don't have to. And there are all sorts of things they can offer, but a parent is also not bound to follow that.
Right.
And the youth is not bound to follow that. And that's one of the things we saw in the fatality committee. Frequently, a youth can just bounce, even if they have services, even if they've been diverted, they could just disappear. And we have the situation where we, on paper, think they're diverted, where they have this SINs tool we could use, but they're gone. And that's as good as nothing. So I'll ask my final question. It's my belief we really need as a committee visibility into this. And as Delegate Bartlett mentioned, potential for the continuation of the council to look at these things. Frankly, I'd like to see a continuation of the council who had some access that I had, so they could really see, the things the public can't see, the things we can't see right now as lawmakers. We could see the story from start to finish and really look at some of the cases where we have these repeat offenders, these escalating courses of conduct. If we did decide to do something along those lines, in your opinion, what do we look at? Where do we look? What parts of the system do we consider?
Everything. And I think that unique access that you had certainly can be made anonymous so that you don't necessarily know the name of the kid, but that history.
I would add, to your point about SINs, I think that one of the reasons why parents and sometimes youth are not opting into the SINs as a resource is because we don't have enough programs at that level. We need, a variety of programs that are attractive to the families and attractive to the young people. They're very limited in scope. So if you offer a young person or a family one program and it doesn't necessarily fit their goals, then they really don't have any other recourse. So my recommendation would be to, increase funding for additional diversion programs that could be utilized through a SINs petition.
What we should look at if we had transparent access to the system?
Yeah, I assume you're meaning if you could understand.
If we could look at a case, if we could look at a particular youth and how they move through the system, what would we look at?
To me, it's, I think some of it is to see, are kids getting access to the services that they actually would benefit from the most? Are we making things available for kids around the state? I think that we know already the answer is no, that we're not, that some kids have much greater access to services. The area around Baltimore is much richer from a service perspective than it is in other places. We have choice like that Eric runs. You have ROCA dealing with violence. You have youth advocate programs. I think something like the DGS is starting to do with this Thrive Academy, the intent is to have it be around the state. But we need things at that front end that keep kids from getting further into the system. Has to be the ambition. So I would want to look at that for sure. I think the question about that some of that you have seems to be about when young people are in the community and they're on probation, what's actually happening, or when they're not even on probation, if they're being diverted, what's happening. Like, sure, I think it's worth looking at that. I will say, like, the council, the people on the council had a lot of access to what that looks like in a lot of variety of ways, including two young people who are representatives on the council themselves. But yeah, I would love to further that conversation too.
All right. No more from you now. Delegate Boucher.
Thank you, Chairman. And thank you, Mr. Bayless, for your candidness. I want to preference this question with the fact that I was a juvenile offender at 16, charged and convicted as an adult, and served 9 months on a 3-year sentence. And I'm going to lead off with this. If most juvenile offenders come in contact once with the law, and around 45% of the offenses are by repetitive offenders, would it be wise to remove them from the communities they live in, and would it substantially reduce crime?
Okay. Melissa, do you want to go? Or you want me to go?
Well, it depends. The 45% of those cases, some of those kids, that first time they came in, it was on a pretty minor thing and they were 13. And so, if you could, and some communities have done this, to try to better identify those kids that are likely to be the repeat offenders, and then make sure you're loading them up with services on the front end, and don't wait until they are already, 4 or more offenses in their career, so to speak, but to deal with them, to pay closer attention to who are the kids that are coming back again and again. And Maryland, I think, has, DJS has data capacity to do that kind of research. And then to monitor it on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, so again, this gets where it's very difficult, the difference between like your remarkable experience. And I don't know whether you thought your experience was good, bad, or otherwise, but obviously you've achieved a ton after having that experience. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, that's not the outcomes for most young people when they are locked up, when they are sent away, and certainly when they're tried and charged as adults. And so that becomes hard in sort of responding to it. What we can see from study after study is, by and large, when young people are incarcerated, they have worse outcomes on the things that we're talking about here, worse public safety outcomes, in addition to other life outcomes when they're locked up. Like, there's lots of research that speaks to that. And there's lots of reasons for that, including some of the things that we're already talking about, things like whether they'll ever get back into school while they're, once they're locked up, and when they come back to the community, things like their job opportunities, all kinds of things that become challenges. So we didn't, as a council, get into the question of, this wasn't, as you saw with the lineup of who was on the council, this was not a big progressive abolitionist council looking to like fundamentally change the nature of Maryland. Kids can still be committed. There's an understanding in the law when they're restricting the idea of kids with misdemeanors, unless there's a firearm related, of why they can't be committed, is understanding the overall negative impacts when kids get locked up. That overall, in our juvenile justice system, we should do our very best when kids are incarcerated, and they should get the best schooling possible. And I think DJS is working that. I can't speak for everything that Mr. Maroney is seeing in the facilities. But overall, when kids are the ones who are really demonstrating to us that their lives are crumbling, that they're making increasingly bad decisions, there obviously needs to be a pause, right? Something needs to disrupt that behavior as it's happening. But then those kids need our very best. They need the very, very best things we have to offer. And I think that's where it gets really challenging, because too often when we incarcerate kids and we send them away, and we send them far away from their homes in locked settings, we saw what happened in COVID, which might be an extreme, where kids were isolated in their rooms. right? Kids are inherently social beings who need to be around. We meet so many young people who are locked up in this stage of their life. It is the time of adolescence where people are having their first girlfriends, people or boyfriends, people are learning to drive, all of these things get lost. And so I struggle with this because I understand why some young people maybe can't walk around in the community today because of something that they did. But we also have to know that how overwhelming the research is that tells us what happens when people get locked up. So I'm not, I think DJS should continue to have they should have the best residential services in the country for when kids get locked up. But every one of these young people is going to return, whether it's to their own community or to a community. And we want them to come back and be kids who achieve in life and stay away from this system.
I would say that it wasn't a focus of the JJRC, but the doing a better job in that reentry process to help kids come home from whatever confinement they experience with a leg, to have that transition be a better one. Because if you take kids and you put them in a very structured environment that's very punitive, and then you just put them back home where they may not have much in the way of supervision at all, and don't be surprised if it doesn't stick.
The three biggest factors I can advise you on is this, from my experience. One, you have to be removed from the adversarial environment you're in that caused it to take place in the first place. You have a lot of peer pressure and a lot of bad hombres out there that victimize and use younger juveniles. The second thing is you have to have extensive mental health resources and counseling. None of us truly know what these juveniles have gone through. And the third, and one of the most important, is you have to have purpose and meaning in your life to get up and go to work. They have to have vocational and educational training to self-sustain themselves. If we can address those three issues, we can reduce this. And if it means removing some of these kids from those bad neighborhoods, it's paramount to do that. You can't expect a juvenile who walks in a neighborhood and all of his friends are doing drugs and breaking in stores for them not to be tempted to follow the same routine. So that's about all I can say on it. Best of luck to you.
Isn't that so?
That's right.
Very, very briefly, one of the challenges, and I'm taking, you have a question? Let's give Delegate Tomlinson a question.
He said,
give him a question, but I'm going to try and get us out of here by no later than 6:05. So please.
I know, I don't know why I'm talking, because I need to get to this. I need to get to the city for a concert. No, I don't disagree with, I've enjoyed what you've had to say, and obviously there's a lot of changes that need to be made. But one of the things that has been in the news and we've been hearing about, and I don't really think it's been talked about a lot. And I know you mentioned earlier that youth crime is down across the country and that it's maybe the whole issue's been a little sensationalized. But the particular crime that we've been hearing so much about and it's been getting a lot of media attention has been all the auto thefts.
Yes.
And
I say this as someone who's about to drive down to Baltimore City, so I hope things go well. But the Mayor Scott just said last week that that auto thefts, youth auto thefts, are up 166% this year. So this is happening.
Yes.
And I know the chief of police in Baltimore County, he talked about how folks under age 13 are getting recruited to steal these cars. Do you agree that we should be looking at a change to the law to include auto thefts, or just keep things as they are?
Well, so
as it relates to
a couple things with that. So I think I just want to clarify, when I was saying youth crime compared to the 1990s and over a long period of time is down, there has been an increase. It would appear right here, like in the last couple of years. I don't deny that. So and stolen cars is a huge thing. And I was glad that earlier that Officer Boatwright made sure we clarified the difference between stolen cars and carjackings, both of which are serious and both of which are happening, but they're very different things in terms of what's going on. But I also want to point out, because I was so glad that Vice Chair Bartlett pointed this out earlier, which is something that doesn't get said enough. So again, I know lots of us are parents. Like, I have a 12-year-old who turns 13 in 9 days. So this thing about the law and the 13 and the 12 and the whole thing, either way, when we're talking about a 12-year-old or 11-year-old, if it's true that they're being coerced into stealing cars as part of because people know that they can't get in trouble because they're 12, I mean, it's tough. Like, this is where I'd love to see the data about the 12-year-olds, like, and the cars. However, the idea of understanding this, whether it's a car, whether it's a gun, whatever the thing is, when we're talking about kids of this age, the idea that they are being trafficked, that these are young people who are that others are driving their behavior as opposed to them doing it, is something that we're talking about, things that we should look into, is something really important to understand, like to understand how that's happening. So no, it's very hard for me to imagine when 11-year-olds, and again, even just talking about stolen cars, and we haven't even talked about this today, and I won't go at length, but young people do things in groups, which is one of the really hard things about all this. And I'm sure it's hard as a prosecutor, and I'm sure it's hard with everything, but like, kids don't on their own, like a 12-year-old, go and get in a car. Like, they're doing things as groups of kids, which makes it hard to understand who's leading the charge and who's not. If 18-year-olds are with 12-year-olds, I'm going to guess the 18-year-olds are leading it and not the 12-year-olds. So I think it's important to understand this. I think the idea that we're going to reduce auto thefts by prosecuting 11-year-olds for when it happens, I don't see the link between the two things. And to me, that feels like a real stretch. And I think just generally, the idea that the only means for accountability is through prosecuting a kid, especially at that age, I think is where our imaginations need to be greater than that, and understanding that, frankly, like a program like Choice, but not needing it to be in the system like Choice, where there's mentors and there's people who are advocates for young people and building relationships, is going to be much stronger than anything we can do through arrest and prosecution.
And the data, well, people were talking before, I had looked up on the FBI, and I didn't have time to look at the newest data, but back in 2019, of all the reported thefts, not carjackings, but thefts of vehicles, police cleared by arresting someone only about 15% of them. And of the ones where there was an arrest, only 13% of those arrests the clearance was attributed to a youth. So that means there was an adult involved. So there's a lot that we don't know, because the police are not necessarily solving a lot of those crimes. And that's what people have to report it for their insurance. So that's actually one of the things where we know about the crime as reported to law enforcement more than for a lot of other things.
All right, we're a little after 6. I'm going to go with a very maybe now a couple, quicker questions. But one of the concerns that I have is you talk about ramping up the services and diversion and everything else. And one of the things I hear consistently is that it's very difficult to grow these programs. They are traditionally very small and deal with small numbers of kids. So it's hard for a ROCA, and I've heard this from ROCA, it's hard for ROCA to simply pick up their model and move it somewhere else, because it takes years to set that up. Have other states around the country found something that's relatively easy to duplicate? That doesn't seem to be the case. I haven't found anything yet that has been relatively easy to duplicate, and that I think is part of our challenge in getting resources from the middle part of the state and moving them into the other parts of the state.
Yeah, I mean, my response to that would be, not tooting my own horn, but programs like Choice, we've been across the state we were across the state for many years. 2009, we had significant cuts that took us away from the Eastern Shore, that took us away from Western Maryland. So I think it's about versus finding programs to bring into the state, I think it's about increasing the capacity of the successful programs that's local. Because, you know, in addition to being evidence-based, there's also a cultural relevancy and understanding the community and building relationships with the community over decades. I think that is very helpful.
I appreciate that. And I'll go to one other question that builds on Delegate Tomlinson's question a little bit. And I think also from a couple other members as it's bounced around. The data is in fact very difficult to find and to put together that allows us to say definitively juvenile crime is down or it's up or what have you, in part because the juvenile system is built to be deliberately opaque. It's deliberately opaque because we want to protect these kids in the long term. But that shouldn't stop us from being able to get general data. But with that, and I understand that you know we don't have specific numbers, but we do have now multiple stories going to the vice chair's comments about how kids are being trafficked here that show younger kids, particularly in the car theft area, and being brought into these groups of people and in some cases returning through over and over again. And police officers are seeing it, but they don't see a way forward through the existing system or through the system has been created through JJRC. So I guess one of the questions is that I'm going to have going forward that I would invite you to get back to me about later, so my committee doesn't kill me, is you know, one of the things is, so you have a kid between 10 and 13 who has a gun, has been involved with car theft on multiple occasions. What do you do? Plays their cell phone during committee. What do you do with those people who come back over and over again to address, I think, one of the biggest concerns that people have with the juvenile process, and that is the perception that nothing is happening when that's not always the case. It's always not the case. But when you get those anecdotal stories of here's the 11-year-old who's driving over and over and over again, and then he gets taken back home to the family in Delegate Grammer's district at the end of the night, that I think is another real question that we have to address.
Yeah, and I only just urge, like, I think it's legitimate, and especially the concern of if kids are coming back over and over, that is a obvious, legitimate, important thing to do. But like, I just urge around this car theft thing, like I know it's frustrating. We work nationally, like everywhere in the country, people are going, goddamn TikTok and the Kias and the like this is, you know, it's a national story. So it's like the law here that we're going to respond with a law on it here just feels like it's missing the larger picture of what's going on. I think everyone's more hoping that Kia and Hyundai get their act together than that 11-year-olds are getting their act together. I think that made a better bet.
All right. We have spent these 5 hours together. Thank you all very much. This has been a hearing of the House Judiciary Committee. We thank you all for being with us today, virtually or in person. We'll be back again on December the 5th for the third juvenile justice hearing, where we're going to hear about what other states are doing. And we're going to hear about programming that is taking place here in Maryland. We may also expand it to cover other issues. But until then, we'll see you on December.